Breath of the Wild was a game revolutionary for the new stance on handling player progression and creativity in the Zelda series, with many going so far as to say that it is a complete masterpiece. Despite everything it did right though, the game is far from flawless, enough so that I would argue that the game is absolutely not a masterpiece. For the first time in the Zelda series, Breath of the Wild presents players with a completely open world where the player can go out and do whatever it is they wish, and do events in just about any order. This means that the story and music would be handled in a new way not before seen in the Zelda series, in an attempt to account for the new open world format. This new style for story, music, and gameplay, what does it mean for Breath of the Wild in relation to the Zelda series and gaming in general? And why would I argue that it doesn't hold up to the title of masterpiece that so many would bestow this entry? We'll be discussing all that and more in this video that's become way longer than I thought it was going to be, as it's been in development for the past 2 months now. This is the most insane video editing project I've ever worked on, and has seriously screwed up my sleep schedule further than I ever thought possible, so I genuinely hope you enjoy it. Considering this is a 3-hour video, it's probably best enjoyed with breaks, so feel free to come back later whenever you'd like to hear some more of my thoughts. Don't worry, I won't go anywhere. There are 4 main sections to this discussion, as I'll be separating Breath of the Wild into the 3 aspects that I believe make up a game. So we'll be discussing story, music, gameplay, and then the experience as a whole, in that order. As well, sometimes I'll go on tangents about game design before relating Breath of the Wild back to it, such as discussing engagement in video games, or what exactly it means for a video game to be realistic towards social and cultural norms. We'll have a few tangents like this thrown in, so even if you disagree with all of my opinions presented in the video, you can still hopefully learn something new about game design along the way. So even if you hate me and my opinions, I hope you can still take something meaningful away from this video. I'll link timestamps in the description for every train of thought I go down on this video, so check down below to find that. For my background, I'm currently going into my 4th year of university, where I'm pursuing a Bachelor of Science in Computing Science, while also working towards a certificate in game design, with the hope of one day becoming involved with the gaming industry. The game design tangents I go on during this discussion will often stem from what I've learned during my game design courses in university. Keep in mind that most of what's presented in this video is my own opinion. If your opinion is different from mine, that's perfectly fine. Please don't get riled up because my opinion is different than yours. I'm literally one guy making a video on the interwebs. I'm down for debate on the subjects I present during this discussion, and will gladly answer any questions you may have. The best place if you'd like to discuss or ask questions is in Discord in the description below, as I'm not always on top of the comments, but I'll certainly try my best to be. As well, I'll be using several other games as examples throughout this video, so be warned about spoilers for everything currently on screen. Well, that and all of Breath of the Wild. The only real major spoilers apart from Breath of the Wild are for Pokemon Mystery Dungeon 2, but it's just footage and I give a spoiler warning before that part for anyone who wants to switch tabs or look away and keep listening. I also spoil all of Chapter 1 of Xenoblade Chronicles 2 during my discussion on creating first impressions on players, but I give a spoiler warning before that as well, and it's literally just the first hour of the game anyway. If that's all alright with you, then let's get our journey underway. I'd like to start our discussion with the story. Let's build up the setting for the rest of the discussion. I'll be starting out with a summary first and foremost, for anyone not familiar with the story or who'd just like a brief refresher. Link wakes up from the Shrine of Resurrection after having seemingly slept for 100 years, unsure what it is he needs to do. He gets a new iPad, and meets up with a hang-gliding old man who agrees to give Link the sick-ass hang glider if he goes around collecting the 4 spirit orbs from the shrines in the Great Plateau. Link then goes around updating his iOS about as frequently as in real life, getting the spirit orbs from the monks in the shrines absorbed into his body and probably getting lung cancer before Thanos snapping the monks away.
I don't feel so good.
After then meeting the old man in the Temple of Time, he reveals himself to be the ghost of Christmas past, Hyrule's king, whose kingdom fell to Ganon's forces long ago. 100 years ago, they predicted the return of Ganon, because he's that asshole who always has a bone to pick. the people of Hyrule uncovered ancient weapons they decided would be worthwhile to reactivate and use as weapons against Ganon, as they were seemingly used as such in the past. The main discovery were the robots from the Incredibles and the 4 divine beasts. Each beast was assigned a champion, each representing a different race from Hyrule. Ganon, however, Grand Theft Auto'd all the weapons meant to be used against him, killed the champions, and nearly killed Link. Link was brought to the Shrine of Resurrection, while Zelda held back Ganon's full power for the past 100 years while Link slept. After hearing this story, Link is tasked with defeating Ganon, saving Zelda, and restoring the land of Hyrule, and is advised to wrest control of the divine beasts away from Ganon to use against him. While advised to go to Kakariko Village, this is where the world truly opens up, and the player can really do whatever it is they want, such as in my case, launch into the castle at the speed of sound to immediately kill Ganon after being awake for nearly 24 hours straight and only having 3 days of practice to learn how to speedrun the game to fundraise for the Stollery Children's Hospital. Alright, maybe that's not an intended option by the developers, but point is, this is where the world opens. It is now your playground. If the player chooses to follow the story quests, they can unlock flashback memories to uncover the full story of the past, which includes Zelda desperately trying to unlock her power to defeat Ganon, but continuously being unable to do so, and being chastised and judged by those around her, except for Link. If the player frees the divine beasts from Ganon's control, Link frees the spirits of the champions, who resume their command on the beasts. After however much preparation and exploring time the player has taken, Link finally confronts Ganon, who escapes Zelda's control right as Link shows up, because how else would you have a final boss, really? Link defeats Ganon with a bow of light and saves Hyrule. That's the simple version of the plot summarized. There are some things I like throughout the story, but also several problems I have. One of the biggest problems is definitely about taking control of the divine beasts back. 100 years ago, Ganon sent out monsters that killed the champions and took over the divine beasts. Link restores control to the spirits of their original owners, sure, but why does that matter? What I mean is, why doesn't Ganon just take it over again? He did it once before, and while there were actual champions guarding it, some of the toughest of each of their races, and now there's literally nothing but a spooky ghost keeping each divine beast safe. Even if he can't send another Blight level of monster, if he got some random bokoblin to just stroll into the divine beast, what's a spooky ghost gonna do about it? He took all 4 divine beasts easily before. Why doesn't he just do it again, instead of letting himself get shot by 4 mega lasers like a complete idiot? But what if Ganon was just occupied with Zelda so he couldn't send anyone? The beasts were filled with monsters controlling it before Link showed up to them, so you'd think the guardians or monsters would be smart enough to just waltz up and take it again as it sits on whatever cliff it's on with a laser pointed at their master for probably months. Or what about during a blood moon when the monsters just spawn everywhere anyway? What are the champion spirits really gonna do about it? Just ask the monsters politely to leave? One thing I'm bummed about, but also kind of understand why it was done, is the absence of a Ganondorf. It would have been really neat to have had a figure as the antagonist actually speak to Link, share his thoughts about being held prisoner for the past 100 years by a princess who keeps being 17 for the past 100 years like Ash is just 10 forever. This used to be one of my bigger complaints, but after my game design classes at university, I think I feel a better appreciation for the choice to not do that. By not allowing Ganon to speak, to not take a human form, the game quite literally dehumanizes him. It strips him down to his pure malice and purpose in the plot as a purely evil creature. Through the dehumanization of Ganon, Breath of the Wild makes the argument that he is beyond redemption, that there is no reasoning with him, that he is simply a creature hell-bent on destruction. So while a Ganondorf would have been neat, on reflection it may have actually been better as it was. There's a few tidbits with the plot I definitely did enjoy, such as the fact that this game actually gave reasoning for Link being a silent protagonist, as revealed by some of Zelda's journal entries. Silent protagonists have become such a standard in the world of video games, so I find it fascinating when games like Fire Emblem Three Houses or Breath of the Wild actually give reasons for the silence, typically something important to the backstory of the protagonist. I also quite liked how the Spirit of the Sword from Skyward Sword does actually speak to Zelda for how to save Link's life, as a reminder that she's always with you through each of these adventures with the sword. For one criticism though, look, I know it's an easy target, but I have to mention it. How am I supposed to take characters seriously when 17-year-old Zelda is wearing pants probably tight enough to cut off blood flow? Yes, I know I play Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and that is one of my highest praised games ever, and it's something I'm on the fence about there as well, among other games. There's two sides to this argument. One side argues it's not exactly realistic wear, it's clearly put in to draw attention to. It doesn't serve any purpose towards the story, and really just detracts from it by creating what we may call a distraction in what would be an otherwise serious scene. Well, you know what I mean.
Very potent effects under the proper circumstances. Ta-da!
It just makes something for the player to go, pfft, really? Let's flip to the other side though. Who cares if designs are unrealistic? But what does it actually mean to be unrealistic? I'm sure a giant malice pig monster is unrealistic. I'm sure an iPad that can start and stop time is unrealistic. I'm sure launching yourself across the world at the speed of sound is unrealistic. Well, I mean, that one's a glitch. One of the best ones in the game, actually. When assessing the realism of video games, or media in general, people will naturally target the social and cultural aspects of the media in question, and usually not the other aspects like the physical rules of the world. In my use of history in video games class, one of our key examples of this was Battlefield 5, where we watched a trailer and were asked to identify the main problem that people at the time had with it was. For those like me who've never touched a Battlefield game and are unsure what Battlefield 5 is, it's a shooter set during the Second World War. The problem people had with the trailer was that it depicted a woman fighting in the Second World War, with people saying that by including a woman in World War II, that Battlefield had done away with all semblance of realism. As our professor then showed us a clip of somebody climbing into the tailgunner seat of a plane as it flew by overhead, climbing through the wings and the propeller. Our professor then went on to prove that it wasn't that women did not participate in the history of World War II, it's that they were erased from it, and there did exist several platoons of women fighting in the war. Point is, when judging realism in media, people will target the social and cultural aspects of it, whether it be a woman fighting in Battlefield 5, same-sex relationships in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, or Zelda's inflatable pool floaty looking ass in Breath of the Wild, while other aspects such as the physical laws of the world or the media are typically just accepted instead of contested. In historical games such as Battlefield 5 or Assassin's Creed Odyssey, these kinds of criticisms stem from the perspective of historical accuracy, arguing that such a thing did not happen during those times, even though they actually did in both of those examples. But for a game set outside the history of our own world, why should that game follow what people expect to be cultural norms anyway? The world becomes a reflection of the art style and choices on the part of the developers for how they want their world to be shaped. Who are we to say they're not allowed to do it a certain way? For my own feelings on the matter towards character designs in Breath of the Wild, well, more like Zelda's design, I do feel it's unnecessary to have that part of her model be as much of a focus as it is. It makes it hard for me to take her character seriously. I won't say she looks unrealistic, and I just got through the argument on why that can't really be applied, but I do feel it's definitely off-putting to being able to see her character in a serious manner, but it's the developer's choice and reflection of artistic style. I'm sure it won't be the last game that makes it hard for me to take somebody seriously due to questionable design choices. Those were some smaller things I wanted to mention about the story, but now for my main arguments I want to make about the plot. The most intriguing part about Breath of the Wild's story is most of the actual story is before the story you're currently playing, having been 100 years ago. The story you're currently playing is Ganon fucked you up in the kingdom and all that, and he took our massive laser weapons like an asshole. Take them back and screw him up. If the player doesn't follow any of the story quests, that's all the story really becomes. It is up to the player's decision how much or little of the story they'll take in, by reclaiming the divine beasts and unlocking flashbacks to build up the backstory of this world. But there's no order to the divine beasts, and the memories can be done in any order even though there is a timeline of events, and this is all a consequence of it being an open world game. Let me explain. A story, by its nature, is an order of events. First A occurs, then B occurs, then C. There's an order to these events. You can't open a novel, flip to a random point in the story, then flip to another random page and keep reading. Almost always it won't fit together. So when you have a game like Breath of the Wild completely open the world to you and tell you, you know what? There's event A, event B, event C. You can do whatever you'd like. of course the story would naturally fall apart to at least some degree. Stories are linear. Breath of the Wild by its nature is not linear, which results in a plot that, excluding the story before the events of the game, is abstracted down to get shooty lasers, fuck up Ganon. Non-linearity means a story finds itself cutting corners, like Zelda's been holding off Ganon for 100 years, please believe us, or you need the Bow of Light to defeat Ganon, here it is out of thin air randomly. Many problems I have with the story is because the developers had to form a story that could be experienced in whatever order due to the nature of the game itself. To me, the most important aspect of a game is the story and the music. It's what I'll think back on and be glad that I got to experience such an incredible journey. If the gameplay is good, then that's just a bonus. The strongest stories can be formed when they are linear, since that's how a story works after all, so my favorite games in general are typically linear ones. That isn't to say every game needs to have a linear and engaging story. Different games will focus on the three aspects of gameplay, story, and music in their own way, which in the case of Breath of the Wild I feel is an almost complete sole focus on the gameplay aspect. There's nothing inherently wrong about that, it's just not what I expect from a Zelda title. When it comes to linear stories, I really don't mind going through something like Skyward Sword as it spoon-feeds me plot bit by bit. I love good stories, I'll be like, yes, more please! I know some people really don't like linearity, but a story is linear by nature. Books and linearity go hand in hand. Movies and linearity go hand in hand. But video games and linearity don't always go hand in hand, meaning video games and storytelling don't always go hand in hand, making video games one of the trickiest and most fascinating facets for storytelling. It's because of this, and because of the personal impact a video game can have over other forms of storytelling, that I feel a plot in a video game can be one of the most difficult to nail a narrative in. If a completely open experience is offered to the player in a case such as Breath of the Wild, it's not impossible to form a story, but it needs to be handled in a different manner than storytelling in a linear game, and there exist consequences when not handled properly. For example, all the champions felt to me like they had one or two personality traits and no real depth to them, except Mipha, you get the clear. Daruk just kinda felt like a tough guardian type character, same with Urbosa honestly, and That Ain't Falco was just an asshole.
How about up there?
And because the Divine Beasts could be done in any order, you couldn't exactly have somebody along with you to really connect with on your adventure who's also imperative to the plot, Midna being a strong example of that. So there wound up being a companion character for each of the 4 Divine Beast quests, without having the time to really be fleshed out or really likable. Except for you, Sidon, you're literally the best. Going off of memory, I've actually forgotten the names of the Rito and Goron companion. They were both pretty forgettable to me. The Rito was actually pretty cool, but got so little screen time and impact that he becomes easily forgettable. I honestly don't remember what he was even doing there. It's like we met him, got some help from him, and then forgotten forever, like Absol in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Rescue Team. If I'm wrong about stuff like this and he was present in more parts, or I'm wrong about other character examples later on, then I just attribute it to it being forgettable. The Goron was just kinda annoying, I couldn't really like him at all. Riju was pretty neat though, and I did like her as a companion, even if it made no sense for her to carry the Thunder Helm to shield you instead of just giving you the Thunder Helm like anybody above 20 IQ would probably do. Sidon needs no words, he's just majestic. With both the champions from the past and the companions from the present, I feel like they weren't as fleshed out as much as they could be. Legend of Zelda has always had charming side characters, and this game still has some of those here and there, but I feel like for the most part the champions and companions just weren't that. Part of this is because of the format of the story. It's open world, there's no set order, and there can only be so much time for each of these side plots, so there's only so much of an opportunity to establish each of these characters, unlike characters that can continuously appear as a linear story progresses. That doesn't mean it's impossible to make these characters great, Sidon is proof of that, it just becomes a bit tricky sometimes. It can't just be so easily done in the same format as a linear Zelda game and expect it to work out for an open world Zelda game. It needs to be handled with a new formula for an open world story in mind, and I feel like the effort to make it happen just wasn't even considered in several cases. It feels very much like the same formula for a linear story was used, which resulted in the characters suffering when put into an open world environment. Like Teba, I just now looked up his name, could have had more of a physical presence I feel within the Rito plot, instead of having like 10 minutes of screen time, then you're on the Divine Beast, bye bye! There could have been some character development within these characters, Like, the Goron companion found his courage, I guess, but he's annoying, so I don't really care. Or take Falco, for example. That's his name now. It really wouldn't have been that hard to make him go from being a cocky asshole into realizing that he needs to be able to rely on others. But no, he just went from being an asshole into being a ghost asshole. That's it.
Don't preen yourself just for doing your job.
On editing this video, I realized that Falco actually did have some development. Well, I mean, not really, but sort of.
After all these years, I simply must admit the truth. Even without the power of flight, Link made his way to this divine beast and accomplished something that even I could not. Guess I was wrong about how lucky he would be.
Characters such as Midna begin to grow through their time with Link and change their nature. While Falco has barely any screen time compared to a character like Midna, the writers could have at least done something with him instead of being like, there's this bird, okay, and he's a fucking asshole. All the champions in general just felt like they had some personality trait or two, and that's all their characters summed up to be throughout the story, or at least what scraps of the story they got to be a part of. Allowing the player to enjoy events in any order of a story will naturally make a story fall apart, sure, but that shouldn't be an excuse to neglect taking the time to properly flush out those who actually have meaning in the story being told. To learn proper character writing for the new open world format instead of using the cookie cutter. This sort of worked during linear storytelling, so maybe something similar-ish will probably work during non-linear too, maybe? For the main characters, it didn't really feel like Link changed all that much, but I mean it's Link. That's pretty standard, so that doesn't really matter too much. Zelda to me felt lacking, and like I could never genuinely like her character. I believe the reason for this is because of the open world format where the player can go around gathering these brief memories, rather than it being sloppy writing. She knows she has a duty to live up to, but feels like the world is on her shoulders, quite literally. She wants to pursue her passions, but is pushed towards unlocking her power to seal Ganon, and admonished by those around her because she has yet to unlock the power needed to save Hyrule. It's not that she doesn't try, she gives it her best effort, and feels useless to those around her, who will continue hating her because of it. It feels like everyone is against her, so she'll push people away, including Link, who doesn't even speak. Eventually, she realizes she can trust Link, and he becomes her gateway into a world outside the world resting on her shoulders, and everyone turning against her because of her inabilities. I don't think that's lazy writing to any degree, but despite that, I could never find myself genuinely connecting with her character. I think it's because of the open world and fragmented story format that needed to come with an open world adventure that made it constantly feel like something was just missing. Sure, there are some parts of the writing that I think are bad just because it wasn't written all that well with consideration to the open world style, but also some parts such as Zelda's character where I feel they were on the right track, but actually experiencing it makes it feel like it just falls apart to some degree due to the nature of the game itself. I feel like Breath of the Wild has the gameplay and the story fighting with one another in this way, each of which has the potential to be great in their own respects, but together just don't find the harmony one expects from a Zelda game. Not to be confused with ludonarrative dissonance, which, for those who don't know, is when a game's story and gameplay seems to disagree with one another. Like, take this example of a game I just made up, where in the story the player's character expresses they want to help people and do the right thing. Then in gameplay you can immediately go out and start stabbing people with like a fork or some shit. I call it Forking a New Path and you can find it on Steam never. There is a conflict between the story and the gameplay of Breath of the Wild, not because they disagree with one another like ludonarrative dissonance, but rather because it feels like they each have their own set of pieces to their own puzzles, but struggle to find ways to fit together when combined. It feels very much like the gameplay was the focus of the game, and then they had to find ways to make the pieces of the story somehow fit into something not befitting a story of such an open-world adventure. To be fair, the gameplay made really was something incredible for the most part, which I'll get into in that section later on, but I feel like its format didn't have the proper framework to support a story, at least this type of story, by having a non-linear adventure attempt to tell a linear story. All in all, from a storytelling perspective, it really just felt like an overall strange and just unpolished experience to me, in that they weren't quite comfortable crafting a story around the system of gameplay and world. It felt like I was always missing something. I have no real better way to describe it than this. My family and I will sometimes play through Zelda games together, or go to the Zelda symphonies that tour sometimes. For the games, it can be nice to sit back and enjoy the story together, but throughout Breath of the Wild, it really always felt like something was missing. At the end of the game, at watching the ending for the first time together, we just gave one another a collective look of, what the fuck? Just so perplexed that that was the whole experience. We weren't missing anything, it's just that there was nothing to fill in what felt like an empty hole in storytelling. I felt embarrassed that I took the time to share that story. I was going into it blind as well at release, expecting it to have an awesome storyline, especially considering the way the trailers portrayed the game, which I'll get into later. What I wound up sharing, though, was not something I would have had I known the story ahead of time. It just wasn't worth sharing. Instead of a collective, hey, that was nice and enjoyable, after playing either Zelda or other games together, I just got looks of, the fuck you just show me and why? Yes, a story where you can do things in any order will make it fall apart to at least some degree, but even so, I feel like it could have been handled better. I feel like my biggest problem with the story is just a lack of it, that only so much could exist within the setting of an open world game, and even what is there could have been cleaner and more fleshed out. A story should exist to complement a game, rather than feeling disconnected from the game part of the game because it couldn't quite fit right. It should optimally create an experience to look back on and feel content and satisfied for having gotten to experience such a thing, rather than feeling hollow and of little significance to the game. Now, music is one of the most important aspects of a video game to me. When I saw the trailers for Breath of the Wild, I thought it was some of the most incredible music I'd ever heard. It just so perfectly captured the emotions it needed to, and made it feel like the music was in charge of the situation. I still to this day believe that the Breath of the Wild trailers are some of the best game trailers in the industry, but that doesn't mean it's reflective of what to actually expect from the game. I went into this game believing it would have one of the greatest game OSTs I'd ever listened to if it was anything close to the trailers, but it really wasn't even slightly close to the trailers. Before we hop into the music though, let's establish player engagement in video games. This is going to be a long tangent on game design, but believe me, I will relate it back to music and mostly the title screen, so bear with me here, and hey, you may learn something along the way. Consider the following. Most players of a game will not even finish the game after starting. This is a common occurrence for almost any video game. Let's look at Assassin's Creed Odyssey for an example, which has an achievement for finishing each of the 9 chapters of the game. The following statistics can be obtained from the Steam achievements for the PC version of the game. By the end of the first chapter of the game, you've already lost about a quarter of your player base. By the end, you've lost over 65% of those who first started. Heck, there's even an achievement called This Is Sparta in the game, which you automatically receive for completing the combat tutorial at the beginning of the game. Know how many players got that achievement? 91.1%. That means that before the first combat tutorial is even finished, nearly 10% of players already decided it wasn't worth their time. Either the game just isn't worthwhile, or maybe they'll just play it one day when they have the time, and keep telling themselves that for the next several years as the game sits untouched. Holy gorsh, losing 10% of players right at the very beginning, another 15 more before the end of the first chapter, and 65% total of players by the end? Does this just mean that Assassin's Creed Odyssey is a really bad game? No, actually, it doesn't. I can't speak to the quality of the game because I haven't actually played it yet. The Assassin's Creed series is in progress on my channel, so I'll get to it eventually, but my professor in my use of history and video games class spoke pretty highly of it, so I trust it must be pretty good. It's actually pretty standard for any game to lose most of their player base before the end. Heck, Assassin's Creed Odyssey's 34.1% is actually pretty impressive in terms of how many people stuck it out. Or take one of my favorite games of all time, which you should totally play yourself if you haven't already, it's only like $10 on Steam, called Rakuen. It's developed by the same person who did the music for Plants vs. Zombies, Laura Shigihara, and is a completely story and music-based adventure about a boy in a hospital who works towards learning the backstories of his fellow hospital mates and helping to bring them closure, and it's honestly one of the few games that's made me cry. It's one of my very favorite games, and it's only 6 to 7 hours long. Wanna know how many people finished that one? 25.4% of players. By the end, you've lost 3/4 of your players. Or take another example, this one with multiple endings, Fallout New Vegas. There are 4 endings to this game, each one with an associated achievement. These 4 ending achievements are Eureka, All or Nothing, Veni Vidi Vici, and No Gods, No Masters. The percentage of players that earned each of these achievements is 6.9%, 5%, 3.6%, and 11%. If you make the rash assumption that not a single one of those players went for multiple of those achievements, that everybody only got one ending and called it a day, that means you have a maximum of 26.5% of your players to actually beat the game. Considering how silly it is to believe nobody would go for multiple endings, it's a safe assumption to say that in Fallout New Vegas, you have over 3/4 of your player base quit before making it to the end. Like I said, this is actually pretty normal for any video game, so games like Assassin's Creed Odyssey with 34.1% of players being engaged enough to make it to the end for an open world game, as long as I hear that one is, really is above average. Good on them for making a game that continues to engage you as it goes on. I'll play it one day. Or take another above average example of a game that made an engaging plot that made players want to see resolved, The Walking Dead, the first season. 40% of players made it to the end of this adventure, which really is impressive, I'd say. Sure, you can look at things like The Walking Dead: A New Frontier, with 65.3% of players making it to the end, but you also have to consider that not many people are going to be hopping into the 3rd game in this series of 4, instead of the first one, and it had nowhere near as big of an impact on the gaming industry as the first season of The Walking Dead did. That game really was the talk of the town when it made a splash. So most of the players hopping into this game, I'd wager, were already in it for the long haul with the series in general. Video games really are one of the most interesting facets for storytelling. No other medium draws players in to play as much of a part in the story themselves as in the cases of books or movies or such, and it is a medium where we can see statistics like this that actually shows how many made it all the way to the end. The fact of the matter is, for most games, most players won't make it to the end. And as you can see with statistics such as completed chapters in Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you really are losing players across the entire course of a game. This is why it's important to constantly have systems in place to engage the player, and if the game has to go through a dull moment for one reason or another, to have something that pulls the player's attention back soon after, to lose as few players as possible along the way. A brilliant example of this is in Left 4 Dead 2, which is a game with AI I highly recommend looking into if you're interested in video game AI design. Left 4 Dead 2 strives to continue to foster player engagement by generating dramatic game pacing. If combat is constant, then the game just gets stressful and fatiguing, you burn out so fast. But if the game has long periods of inactivity, then it's just boring. So what the algorithm does is it estimates the emotional intensity of each survivor and sums it up to obtain the max survivor intensity. Survivor intensity will increase when a survivor is injured or incapacitated or such, and survivor intensity decays when infected or killed. At least that's the simple version. It then uses the sum of the survivor intensity to determine how the game will go. If the emotional intensity is determined to be too high, the game will give players a break for a while by removing major threats. Otherwise, if the emotional intensity is not yet at that threshold, populate the area with enemies. In this way, the calculated player/survivor emotional intensity is what modulates the infected population and creates a system that serves to engage the player while avoiding burnout or boredom in the process. It is very important in game design to implement strategies into player engagement for this same purpose, keeping up the percentage of those who actually make it all the way to the end of your game as much as you can. What does this have to do with music though? Or as I mentioned before this little lesson on game design, the title screen. Well, music is one of the key factors in building the world around you and helping to build an engaging experience, whether it be having an incredible environment with beautiful music to accompany it that makes you say, wow, this is absolutely incredible. I can't wait to see what this game throws at me next. Or some absolutely epic battle music that makes you say, well, it actually makes you too stunned with how epic it is to say anything, honestly. or whether it's a kick-ass trailer theme that makes you say, I need to play this game. Music is one of the most useful tools for player engagement, and one of the most important places to showcase music is on the title screen. Why? Remember how Assassin's Creed Odyssey lost 10% of its player base before even completing the combat tutorial? Or let's look at Fallout New Vegas again, for example. 7% of players gone before even creating their character at the very beginning of the game. And over 50% of players gone before even completing the unskippable tutorial quest at the beginning of the game. The first impression a game makes on a player is the most important, because it's what determines whether the player decides the game is worth their time, or whether they just wasted their money and it should now collect dust or be sold off, or be put on the back burner basically forever. After the combat tutorial for Assassin's Creed Odyssey, you've got 90% of players left you've got to convince to stick around, and by the end you've got 35% of players left to convince to stick around. So the earlier on it is, the more important engagement becomes, because that's when you have the most attention. You want your viewership/player base to lessen as little as possible as it goes on. Like, I'm sure I'm not doing a good job with that in this music discussion by talking for so long about something that isn't music. You need to convince players early on that this is an adventure worth sticking out. Take Xenoblade Chronicles 2 for example. Spoilers for the first chapter of that game. The game's opening chapter takes time to introduce several of the main characters that will be seen throughout the plot, and then it's like, you've got that, right? Great! The game then proceeds to kill off the protagonist, Rex, after being betrayed by Owl the Edge, who stabs him through the heart, only for Rex to be revived by the being that the bad dudes deceived him into salvaging for them, Pyra, the Aegis, and fighting them off together before escaping, in some of the best cutscenes I've ever seen in video games. This is probably the greatest introduction chapter I have ever seen in any video game. It really makes you go, holy shit, if that's chapter 1, then what's the rest of the game gonna be like? It takes the time to establish the world, the characters, the antagonists, and the conflict, and throw you right into the heat of the drama of a level that most games would reserve for a latter part of their plot. That initial hook really sets the tone for the rest of the adventure, making your introduction to a story absolutely vital. Some movies portray this exceptionally as well, How to Train Your Dragon being an excellent example, by establishing all the main characters in the first scene, as well as most of the musical themes that are then used throughout the trilogy. I would highly recommend checking out other videos that cover the topic of How to Train Your Dragon's intro. YouTubers know the importance of constant engagement when it comes to their videos, as well as the importance of having a hook right at the beginning of their videos to give their viewers a reason to stay. You've been hacked! People really can click off a video at any time, so you need to make sure you don't have dull moments for too long. Hey, I see you. Stay away from that XOK. Don't hit it. Keep watching the video. Even when trying your best though, there will always be times that people click off. Almost everybody who clicks a video won't make it to the end, similar to video games. YouTubers who understand the platform and the importance of having a hook at the beginning will always start out strong. Throw what's best at the viewer first before getting into the story of the video. This is exactly what Xenoblade Chronicles 2 does through its intro. It throws you right into scenes so spicy it feels like it could be the epic finale to countless other games. Or take Astral Chain for example. It establishes some characters and rules of the world, and then the moment you meet your actual character, it transitions from cutscene to gameplay, and you're like, wait, it's gameplay right now? As you're on your way to kick the ass of some baddies before you even know any of the controls. A game has two main first impression opportunities. The title screen, followed by the first chapter, the first episode, the tutorials, or whatever you want to call the opening. In the case of Assassin's Creed Odyssey, this is where nearly 10% and then 25% total of their player base was already lost. So it is vital to have a title screen and an opening sequence that serve to prove to the player that this is an experience worth their time, so as to reduce as much as possible how many players drop the game early on. The opening sequence is where you establish the characters, the setting and the world, the gameplay, but the title screen is where you set the tone. We'll be talking about the opening sequence later in this discussion during the gameplay section. But what is it that the title screen shows, and what feelings does the title screen music evoke in the player? Let's look at some title screen examples with what tones they set. Octopath Traveler is a game based around classic RPGs with elements of modern gaming mixed in, so it sports a title screen that aims to fit the tone of "let's go on an adventure" in classic RPG fashion tone-wise, while still feeling like something fresh and new. Astral Chain, despite it having incredibly epic and fast-paced gameplay, the title screen is much more ominous. There is a bustling city in the distance, but the bridge nearby is damaged, and the walls around the outside do make it feel post-apocalyptic. There's a gentle breeze, calm for now, but ominous sounds that signify there is something much more looming going on here. Assassin's Creed Revelations was the final game in the Ezio trilogy, and through its title screen, it sets the tone that this is the end of an era. Or take what I would argue is the best example of a title screen, Xenoblade Chronicles. All before even advancing past the very first menu, Xenoblade Chronicles already takes you on an entire musical journey that serves to portray the adventure and tale this piece of art has to share with you. This is the power a title screen has the potential to have, to set the tone and feel of the experience about to be had, to invoke feelings of how one should view this world, to take you on a complete musical journey that symbolically represents a story one is about to experience, or countless other possibilities. It truly is an understatement to say that the title screen is of little to no importance to a video game. So, what kind of music does Breath of the Wild showcase on its title screen, and what kind of tone does it set? It's not muted, don't worry. That's literally it. Are you kidding me? A title screen has the power to draw emotions out of the player before the adventure has even started when done properly, but the only feelings Breath of the Wild's title screen really draws out is, this is a legit copy of the game, right? This isn't like some bootlegged version or something? I knew I shouldn't have gone for a used copy. I swear, this literally does feel like the title screen somebody trying to rip off a game would make. Here's all the options over here. I want to put in the background though. Guess I'll just slap on some official art I can find on Google and make a slideshow or some shit. This is such a missed opportunity. This is supposed to be your opportunity to prove to the player that this is an experience worth their money, that they're about to be in for a grand adventure, not, here's some pretty pictures, go fuck yourself, I don't care you paid for my game. They could have literally thrown anything over the title screen, anything to make it not just be silence. They could have included one of the trailer themes, which would then have it actually make sense when the trailer leitmotifs are used here and there in the game. The leitmotif being a recurring tune used throughout the adventure, typically used in different parts of the OST to draw emotions out of the player. We'll come back to leitmotifs later though. I know what you might be thinking. Man, this annoying guy just went on and on to make a point that the title screen is shit. First of all, it's my video. Second of all, I want videos like these to also be educational, to really give you insight into how much of an impact something like a title screen has on something as important as viewer engagement. Sure, it may be a video on Breath of the Wild, but I hope it teaches lessons along the way that can be applied into how one views games in general. I really want to get into why it is I view things the way I do, and help you be able to keep concepts such as these at the back of your mind to be able to use in your own critiques of media in general. I wanted to teach lessons along the way, not just say, title screen is shit. I could have done that easily if that's all I wanted to do. So even if you disagree with my opinions throughout this discussion, I hope that there's still something that you can take away from this video. Maybe a new insight or lens with which to view media, or perhaps a greater appreciation for how much depth video games really do have behind them from a design standpoint. Even if you think all of my opinions are terrible and I suck because I slandered your favorite game or some such, I hope there's still something that you can take away from this discussion. Alright, let's hop into the music properly. Now, this is where this section stops being as factual and backed by evidence, and becomes more of my opinion. If my opinion offends you, just remember that it's my opinion, you're free to enjoy whatever you like. Don't get riled up by one guy making a video. Let's start with the overworld themes. While previous Zelda games have boasted active soundtracks that really build up the adventure ahead, Breath of the Wild takes a step back and lets the world take over. For some people, this is enjoyable, but the way I see it, I believe the soundtrack should serve to build the world around you and complement the gameplay in this way, rather than saying to the gameplay and world, I'm gonna go take a smoke, you're in charge. The overworld music steps so far away that you've typically only got some notes every couple seconds, which I personally feel is too far of a step back. To me, it sounds like somebody playing piano for the first time. Maybe some instructions in front of them like, here's some notes you can play together to sound nice, and they do them one at a time as they're getting used to the keys. Let's get this straight, my problem with the soundtrack is not that it isn't in the style of classic Zelda games, where it's in your face and adventurous, maybe even intense in some cases. In fact, I feel like that style of music really wouldn't work here. It worked for small environments of a linear story you're racing across the field in, but really wouldn't work in a game where you're just fucking around, maybe sneaking into a camp here or there, running from some bees, hunting or foraging the surroundings, cooking with Chef Link, or trying to launch yourself at a tree or something. At least the music department had the nerve to make changes to accommodate for the new open world style more than the writing department did, I'd argue. I think going for atmospheric was a good idea, I just don't think it was handled as well as it could be, especially considering it's a musical field which hasn't been explored to this extent in the series before. Atmospheric doesn't mean that the music has to be next to non-existent, that it has to feel like it's not even there. I feel like in the Breath of the Wild soundtrack argument, a lot of people look at the atmospheric style that Breath of the Wild went for, and the more in-your-face active music of past Zelda games, and feel like there's no in-between, that those who don't like Breath of the Wild soundtrack are just pissy that it's not like previous Zelda titles. In my eyes, atmospheric does not mean inactive music. I feel like the best atmosphere is made when the soundtrack exists to complement the tone the gameplay wants to set by adding to it, rather than deciding to largely sit this one out. The best atmospheric soundtrack is one where you can imagine an area without needing to physically see the environment at all, having the music be relaxing but still powerful enough to paint a picture for you all on its own. One could argue Breath of the Wild's soundtrack paints this kind of picture, and sure, I can see it, but I just find it harder to be able to draw meaning out of music when it's barely there, and is created in such a way that it's meant to rely on the gameplay in front of you to be almost fully in charge of painting that picture. I know there's more to this soundtrack than meets the eye, go see 8-Bit Music Theory for that, but it's something I can't find myself getting behind when I don't feel like the gameplay and the music are on equal footing with one another. I feel like the gameplay and the music should go hand in hand, both playing an equal part in creating the environment not only with the player's eyes, but with their ears as well, rather than leaving one to completely take over while the other adds tiny bits and pieces here and there. Sure, it's technically atmospheric, and I can see how this can be found as relaxing, but I can't help but feel like it's just the easy way out of creating a soundtrack that builds the world mentally as much as the gameplay does physically. For the battle themes, I just kind of felt like they were par. They fit what they had to, but didn't really do anything else, never stood out in any way, and were never really all that memorable. Sometimes there were parts that were good, like take the Talus theme for example. It has like 2 seconds that are actually so good and so catchy, and then the rest is just par. Just because it has this catchy 2-second bit you hear every once in a while, doesn't make the entire thing good. Man, how I wish the whole thing is as catchy as those 2 seconds. I feel like there are those out there who name themes like this incredible because of only a very small part of it, which I personally don't feel like is fair to say. This battle theme, for the most part, I feel just fits what it's supposed to, but doesn't go any further. For a theme that does really crank it up though, the Guardian Battle theme. For the tone that it has to set when it comes on in game, it just perfectly matches what it needs to. Sure, themes like the Talus battle are fitting for fighting a stone monster guy, but I feel like the Guardian theme really just strikes what it really needs to a T. Not only does it sound right for the circumstance, but it also captures you emotionally with the feeling of, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit. It's something for you to hear come on in the middle of gameplay to strike sudden panic into your heart, and I feel like it nails it. Guardian battle theme aside, the battle music all felt kind of samey to me, all just kind of being par where it's like, this is good enough. Or music where there is stuff of note, like the few seconds in the Talus battle theme, but is just surrounded with so much filler that it doesn't even matter. Or take the Molduga battle theme for example. It picks up to actually be pretty spicy, but only for certain parts of the fight, which you may only just barely even be able to enjoy depending on how the fight goes. So even though there is parts that do get spicy, you wind up mostly sitting through samey, fillery sounding music for the majority of the fight. I feel like the battle themes all just kind of blend together in this way, and serve to really undershadow the parts that are actually good, like Talus getting catchy as heck for like 2 seconds, or Molduga getting super spicy, because it's too surrounded by pure filler that's just good enough, instead of taking the music further, or at least having a focus on what does go above par, I'd argue. You can tell they know how to write music well, but it felt like for this game they just didn't have the confidence to focus on the parts that could have really made the music stand out, instead just settling for what was good enough. Some of the musical choices really confused me though, with some additions that seemed like just the most pointless things ever. The Shrine Battle theme, for example. On paper, it seems kind of like the others where it's just par and good enough, but listen closely to the instruments in the background instead of what's in the foreground. There's literally a boing sound. Why is this here? What purpose does it serve? There's a killer robot trying to murderize you. You know what would be a fitting accompanying sound for this situation? How about a subtle little boing in the background? It honestly sounds kind of like something someone snuck in to see if any of their coworkers would actually notice, or somebody on the team got wronged in some way, so they snuck in a random boing sound into just about the most unfitting place for a boing sound. I feel like some parts of the musical team were out there giving their best effort at making masterful music, and some other parts were just smoking something really serious. Like, I imagine for the Talus battle theme, somebody threw together the really catchy 2 seconds and was like, hey, I spent a while coming up with this really catchy tune. I think it would make a really awesome battle theme if something was crafted around this tune. And somebody else was like, ugh, that sounds like effort. Let's not focus on that part and just make some generic sounding music. Seriously, the really catchy part and the rest of the Talus theme don't play off of each other in any way. It just sounds like they were made by different people with different goals in mind or something. I feel like a lot of the problems I have with the game is various aspects of the game feel like they're fighting other aspects, or even themselves. For the town themes, generally I feel like they're pretty alright, mostly. For Kakariko Village, I feel like it could be more toned down and relaxing. Sometimes to me it felt a little obnoxious, or like I should expect some shit to go down real fast in the village. Goron City fits what it has to, and that's it really. Just kind of par gets the job done, I suppose. Rito Village though, whoo boy. When a game is able to really nail a soundtrack, it will often use leitmotifs throughout the adventure, using the same tune in different styles to evoke certain emotions in the player, oftentimes being that feeling that this is similar to what you once knew, but it is now somehow different since it's done in a different style with a different tone, with a different setting. Breath of the Wild in this case, however, was like, leitmotifs from this adventure? Nah bro, how about a leitmotif from a different adventure? The leitmotif I mean, well, at least the one I'm currently talking about in this theme, there's technically another one too in the intro of this piece, is the Dragon Roost Island theme from The Legend of Zelda Wind Waker. To those who've played Wind Waker, instead of evoking that this adventure has changed by using a leitmotif from earlier in this adventure, it evokes nostalgia for an adventure long past, and the feeling, times have changed, this is a new journey now, a new era. It really is, frankly, a brilliant use of a leitmotif, by drawing parallels back to a completely different past adventure, and overall I feel like it's just a fitting and relaxing theme in general. Zora's Domain does something similar by taking inspiration from Ocarina of Time Zora's Domain, while being overall pretty relaxing and fitting a watery area. If I'm just listening to the music and imagining the environment though, I would imagine a slightly more wintry one, like an area that's a mix of ice and water, which I attribute to the bells in the background. Bells are typically symbolic of wintry areas, so I'm not exactly sure why this was put in here. It feels kinda like the Shrine Battle boing sound, where it's like even it doesn't know what it's doing there. Unlike the boing sound though, I feel like it does actually help contribute to this piece's relaxingness, but it builds a picture of a slightly wrong environment. It sounds like something I'd listen to as I trek around a partially frozen river and waterfall system or something. So I feel like the choice of bells in the background might be a little misplaced, but otherwise I generally feel like this is a pretty good theme, and could potentially be really relaxing. This sounds like the kind of thing you could expect in a lo-fi remix. For some other town themes, Lurelin Village is pretty decent, honestly. Maybe not the best seaside town I've ever heard, but it gets the job done, and not half bad at being relaxing either. I feel like probably my favorite original town theme is Hateno Village. By original, I mean something newly introduced in this world, unlike something like the Rito or Zora's areas, where they could play off of themes established in previous games. So by original, I mean something that they had to start from scratch from musically. This is one of the themes of the game that not only fits what it has to, but goes beyond just that to create something genuinely enjoyable to listen to. I feel like too much of the soundtrack settle for just being good enough, instead of trying to really excel in their fields. I feel like themes like Hateno Village, Rito Village, or Zora's Domain have been able to mostly achieve excelling in their fields though. Zora's slightly off environment building does bug me a little bit though. Alright, character themes. Let's take a look at the champions. Urbosa was one of those themes that just kind of felt like it fit what it had to, and they've settled on that. Revali's theme wasn't half bad as a theme, and I'll come back to it when we talk about leitmotifs later. As a character theme though, it honestly felt kind of out of character when you consider it's his theme. It's a very humble tune, which is the complete opposite of the character himself. It feels like there was some sort of translation error when talking to the music team or something. Like somebody accidentally said, he's a charming bird, instead of, he's an asshole bird. Or as if somebody was like, do we have a theme ready for Revali? No sir, but we have this pretty nice other theme. Fine, that'll do. We ship next week.
Oh, you must pardon me. I forgot you have no way of making it up to that divine beast on your own.
Mipha's theme was actually really good. It carried with it an aspect of sadness and delicacy, and just really set the tone of her character. Happy to support from the sidelines, even being subjected to the not-so-nice fate of being a spooky ghost. As for Daruk, his theme is almost completely recycled from the trailer, which is rather strange considering I didn't hear any of that in the other champion themes unless I'm just deaf or something. But I'll get back to Daruk when we actually get to the dedicated discussion on leitmotifs. As for the companions, Teba's theme is literally only 20 seconds. What the heck? It uses the same leitmotif as Revali's theme, but it really feels like Revali's theme was created for Teba, and then they were like, this doesn't really fit Revali, but let's shoehorn it in anyway so we can get some leitmotif stuff going. Riju also plays off of Urbosa's theme. At least this one actually works for them both. Yunobo's theme is just like, you know what guys, let's make a character the player can hate. And hate him I did. Unlike the other two, this doesn't really seem to play off of Daruk's theme from what I can tell, which again, was just reusing themes from the trailers. Interesting at least how the first two attempted to play off of one another between the companion and the champion equivalent. Emphasis on attempted for Teba and Revali with how out of character it feels for the latter. But it really feels like there wasn't anything all that enjoyable about any of these companion themes.
Up top! Above you!
Pardon the entrance, but you're a Hylian, aren't you? I was hoping perhaps you'd have a moment to talk.
Sidon's theme is absolutely incredible. It just so perfectly captures his character, I feel. Honestly, one of the best themes in the game. Like the first two, this one also gets inspiration from the equivalent champion theme if you listen closely. But then it makes me really wonder, what the heck is up with this weird inconsistency? 3 of the champion companion pairs have leitmotif musical connections to one another, but none for Yunobo and Daruk? Am I just deaf and can't hear it? Or were the developers really just like, you know what? Fuck Yunobo, am I right, guys? Breath of the Wild does have some jammers in there, but there's just this weird inconsistency when it comes to so much of the music that it really sometimes makes me wonder what they were even smoking over there in the studios. Whether it be the Talus theme saying, I'm an absolute jammer. Ha! No I'm not! Get pranked, nerd! Look, there's the camera! Molduga's theme being like, I get good, but you probably won't be around after the next 3,000 years to hear that part anyway. Shrine Battle theme being like, yeah, boing! Making a theme that fits Teba, but not really Revali, but just using it for both of them anyway, even though they weren't going for leitmotif connections between all of the champion companion pairs anyway. Or the developers deciding they want to use leitmotif connections between the champions and the companions, but by the time they got to Yunobo and Daruk, they were just like, you know what? Fuck that shit, that idea's stupid. Let's make Yunobo stupid and recycle trailer music for Daruk. It's like they ran out of time and panicked or something. Like, if they didn't bother going through with leitmotif connections for all 4 character sets anyway, why wouldn't they even bother just giving Revali's theme directly to Teba to have, and creating a new theme for Revali that fits him better if you're not committing to champion and companion musical connections anyway? It really does feel like this game is just fighting itself a lot of the time. The dungeon themes. First off, the 4 Divine Beasts. Their music was kinda like, well, things sure have gone to shit here, but not really much else. It really felt like one of those situations where it was settled to just go for what works rather than taking the soundtrack further, just settling for what's par. Like, imagine if these Divine Beast themes had an aspect of sadness to them, like a reminder. Remember what they once were? Look at what's become of it now. I feel like a lot of the soundtrack just settles for being fitting enough without having the courage to try anything spicier. The final dungeon of the game, Hyrule Castle, or, also the first dungeon depending on how you play. This theme is praised as one of the shiny examples of the Breath of the Wild soundtrack, I feel like, but I'm not actually certain why, honestly. It gives a feeling of foreboding, like you're up against this menacing, evil-ridden castle, but that's all it does. It doesn't take it any further. Like, why doesn't it have an aspect of sadness to it that the player should ideally feel through the music? A sadness at what has happened to this place. This once great kingdom, fallen and brought to ruin. There's no aspect in the music of, what has happened here? How could this have happened? There's no aspect of epicness, like this is the finale of your journey and you're approaching the strongest foe who threatens all of Hyrule. Sure, Hyrule Castle theme fits what it needs to as a foreboding evil castle looming over you, but that's just its job as a soundtrack. It didn't bother to do anything extra. I feel like one of the reasons this theme is praised so highly is because of the blandness of, say, the Divine Beast themes, or a lot of the other Zelda dungeon themes, honestly. Yeah, it does fit what feeling it has to better than those. I don't think that means it did an exceptional job. I just feel like Hyrule Castle's theme did its job, and that's it. And that it appears much better than it is because it's compared to things that are below average soundtrack-wise, I'd argue. Like, the Divine Beast themes are kinda eh, and I feel like previous Zelda dungeon themes kinda blend together and are forgettable, with some exceptions like some of the Link's Awakening dungeons, for example. There's some serious jammers in there. What are some examples of Final Dungeon approaching the end themes that actually do take it further, though? Take Xenoblade Chronicles, for example. The final dungeon theme of this game not only feels like there is a foreboding challenge looming ahead of you like Hyrule Castle, but also feels like this is the culmination of your adventure. Prepare for the epic finale as you prep yourself to face the final boss. As well, it takes the time to become calmer, sadder, to take a moment to reflect on the fact that everything really has gone to shit, and that this is the character's final chance at making a change. After this brief break, it comes right back into the epicness. Hard. Just imagine listening to something like this as you trek through Hyrule Castle and prepare to face off against Ganon. Or take another final area theme, Astral Chain. This one also makes sure to have an epic approaching the end sort of feel, but this one has a greater emphasis on the sadness aspect than Hyrule Castle and Approaching the End in Xenoblade Chronicles do. It says, look at what this place has become. How could this have happened? What happened here? Go uncover the dark truth. You are our last hope. I'd also like to draw attention to Octopath Traveler's final area theme, known as the Gate of Finis. You cannot leave this place once you've entered. The true final boss lies at the end. If you're here, either you defeat him or die trying. To reach the final boss, you must defeat shadowy versions of past foes, after each of which you learn more about the lore of this world, some of which becomes rather dark. This is the final set of trials, and along the way you uncover the dark truth of the world you have existed in all this time. These 8 separate stories, they've been connected all along, and it's all been building up to this end. The music, it brings in a sense of not just foreboding for the end, it feels like you are uncovering dark mysteries, and the music expresses the sadness and now knowing the dark history that has led up to this point. You're putting little bits of disconnected lore together, figuring out how it all makes sense in the big picture, as the picture in your mind gets clearer and clearer as you trek through the Gate of Finis. The background part of the music with the repeated tune, it sounds fragmented by the way it goes up the notes before suddenly hopping down again, but despite the fragmented feel, it still comes together to form a coherent and downright ominous tune. The background tune seems like something that would have no rhyme or reason to it, but works out all the same. While in the foreground, you've typically only got a few notes playing at a time, with these pauses in between, as if you're only getting part of the music at a time. Like the background, it is fragmented, albeit in a different way. All in all, this theme is not all that dissimilar from how you as the player are receiving fragmented bits of lore, meaningless on their own, but together form not only a coherent, but rather dark and ominous picture of the world this game takes place in. These are examples of OST that go above and beyond, that attempt not to settle on something just good enough, something just fitting enough for the area. Making a soundtrack that only fits the area is just part of a game's job. When it does that, it's what I call par. Taking that further means consideration of how should this music make the player feel? What emotions should it draw out? What emotions are the characters in the story feeling at this moment that we can utilize the music to make the player feel in turn as well? Yes, Hyrule Castle fits the area, but I'd argue it doesn't attempt to connect with the player on an emotional level. If I had to name the emotions that should be felt in this time, sure, there's the obvious of what it actually went for if you're facing a big evil-ridden castle, but I'd also expect there to be feelings of sadness for what kind of terrible fate fell this once great kingdom. What could the people of Hyrule have done to deserve such a thing? How could it have been left to fall to such a ruin? And I would also expect a feeling that expresses that you're approaching the end, that it's now or never, that this is the true trial to save Hyrule. Hyrule Castle's theme just doesn't do that. It's just like, hey, I'm an evil-ridden massive-ass castle. Yes, it fits what it was supposed to at the minimum, but it's just such wasted potential for if they had actually decided to take this theme farther, to draw out emotions in the player that I feel are must-haves to create the best soundtrack you can, which in the case of Breath of the Wild's Hyrule Castle is the feelings of approaching the end, and of sadness for the fate of Hyrule while Link slumbered the past 100 years. This can also be applied to my discontentment with the overworld themes. They were fitting enough for what they had to be, but I feel like they couldn't make that emotional connection that makes a fictional world real. Calamity Ganon, the foe you've been preparing during the entire time you're in Hyrule for, whether that time be 30 hours or 30 minutes. You start the fight, and the final boss music is... well, basically it's like, hey, you're fighting a big bad. No epic conclusion or anything like that thrown in. Just, here's an evil dude in front of you, fuck him up. This is just the first phase, though. First 2 phases? Because halfway through fighting him, he becomes hella pissed and is now like, counter me or die! After Calamity Ganon has been defeated, you now face Dark Beast Ganon, an evil so dark that it is rendered as null Ganon's ability to aim his literal only attack. It starts out as you're facing a big bad, best watch out, and then it just explodes into a full orchestra that's meant to signify the culmination of your adventure. That's the right idea for what you should do in creating the best final boss theme you can. Heck, this theme even pulls off a key change later on, which is an awesome way to bring your final boss theme up in intensity for free partway through. It's like, oh shit, I thought it was for real before, but now it's really for real. A well-executed key change like this one really does incredible work in making the experience just feel completely epic, for lack of a better word. But I have a few massive problems with this final boss theme that really prevents it from shining through for me. I have 3 main problems with this theme. One is directly about the theme, one is about the theme with reference to the actual final boss, and the last is how the theme relates to the rest of the game. Let's go in order, shall we? Let's start with the problem I have with the theme itself. My problem with the theme itself is the piano in the background. Let's face it, the foreground part of this theme is legendary. The way the orchestra just comes together with this epic finale of a theme, it really is breathtaking. Or at least it would be, if there wasn't some dude having a seizure on the piano in the background. If you listen close, there are times the background piano literally isn't even in time with the foreground orchestra. Like, how do you mess up that hard? I understand the desire to have a background bit that sounds random, sporadic, like you're facing off against this complete mess of malice and hate that seeks to bring ruin to the world. But there exist ways to have that feeling of random, sporadic, or even fragmented music. Listen back to the Gate of Finis example from Octopath Traveler earlier. Sure, it's a very different theme, since it goes for ominous, and Breath of the Wild's final boss theme goes for the feel of epic finale, but I feel like it can still illustrate my example of having that random fragmented feel to a musical theme. The background theme goes up the notes before rapidly jumping down again, or even taking some breaks here and there, to give that feeling of random and fragmented, but despite that, it doesn't stray too far from the foreground themes. But Breath of the Wild going for this wild, sporadic feel, it's not even in time with a foreground orchestra. The way I see the piano in the background, it's just a massive distraction. It takes away from the masterpiece that is the foreground orchestra by having some piano player in the corner of the room being like, I want attention, I can play keys too. It's like somebody brought their kid into work that day and was like, mash your face against this controller the way a Yoshi main mashes their face against their GameCube controller. Like, honestly, what even is the story behind this piano bit anyway? I'm honestly actually a bit concerned for the health of whoever was in charge of piano on this orchestra. Or did somebody just sneak it in being like, aha! Nobody will notice some crazy piano mashing I found online. The way I see it, this piano really prevents me from enjoying this theme to its full potential. This theme would be better off countless times over if that piano in the background was just deleted, focusing on the masterful foreground instead of forcing in a background that just doesn't work for the sake of having any background theme at all. That's the thing about what's in the background for musical themes. If you can pull it off and it works, go for it. The music will be way better off for it. But if you can't pull it off, don't force something in that doesn't fit, because it just makes the whole thing fall apart. Now for my second problem, how this theme actually relates to the final boss. Listening to this theme, while suppressing the piano in my head as best I can at least, it just exudes the vibes of a completely epic finale. But then you face the actual final boss. He just bumbles around like an idiot while occasionally shooting a laser in a straight line ahead of him as his only attack. You need to be either blind or clueless to ever be hit by this attack. It serves no challenge whatsoever. And it takes away so much of the epic feeling that the final boss theme would otherwise provide by making you wait just so long. Like, after taking out the second set of targets, I literally just wait for 33 seconds before I can attack him again as another target appears. This final boss is almost completely waiting around while moving at least the 1 km/h required to dodge his one attack. It's the complete opposite of an epic finale. The music, apart from the piano guy, is like, here's this absolutely epic finale to close out your grand adventure, and the gameplay is like, red light, green light, red light. Red light. Red light. Red light. Red light. Green light. Red light. And all you do during the brief time you even get to play the video game is basically break the targets.
Ready? Go!
The mood of the music and the actual gameplay in front of you just don't agree with each other. Wait, aspects not agreeing with one another. Ludonarrative dissonance is when the game's story and gameplay seem to disagree with one another, like a character doing something in gameplay that goes against their character in the story. Ludo comes from ludology, the study of games. Narrative is for the story being told, and dissonance for what difference there exists. Does that mean that this final boss theme has ludo-harmonic dissonance? Is that a term? Let's roll with it anyway. The final boss theme does not agree with the gameplay of the final boss. While the music describes a completely epic finale, the gameplay showcases well, a big pig who can't aim, who you have to wait intervals of over half a minute between times you can shoot him a few times. And thus, the final boss of Breath of the Wild suffers from ludoharmonic dissonance, a disagreement between the music and the gameplay. The aspect where the fault lies is in the gameplay. Apart from the piano guy having an aneurysm, the music was right in its focus on creating an absolutely epic finale. A final boss should feel like that. It's like in developing the final boss, somebody was like, alright, we need an absolutely epic finale. What have you all come up with? And the music department, everybody's super excited and are like, okay, we've thrown together something really special for you that should make an absolutely epic finale. Except for the one piano playing guy in the back with his head down and an expression of, what the fuck have I done? And then in the gameplay department, they're like, oh shit, you wanted epic? We thought you said derpy. Well, we figured out how to make him shoot a laser. And now my final problem with the final boss theme, how it relates to the rest of the soundtrack. But to understand that, first we need to have that discussion on leitmotifs. Leitmotifs are a recurring tune throughout a soundtrack, typically played in different styles to draw different emotions out of the player. Along with key changes, I would argue leitmotifs are one of the key ways to really enhance a soundtrack. By playing a theme you've heard previously in the adventure but in a new style, it gives the feeling of familiarity, but yet it's different somehow. This is still familiar, it's still the same adventure, but things have changed. Let's look at the Pokémon Mystery Dungeon Explorers titles for an excellent example of the use of this. As I'm talking about the music of this game, if you haven't played it yet, please just look away for spoiler reasons, listen to this video in another tab or something, because the Explorers games really are an absolutely incredible experience to have. These games use a few leitmotifs, some of which are actually recurring tunes from the Mystery Dungeon series itself, but the most prevalent leitmotif for the Explorers set of games is this one. This tune is used throughout the entire story, whether it be used to simulate mystery, sadness, adventure, approaching the end, or an epic finale. And it's not just one leitmotif that themes in this game have in common. Take the following tune for instance. Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time, Darkness, and Sky has to be some of the most fascinating games in terms of the musical strategies taken throughout the soundtrack, such as the prevalent use of leitmotifs. These leitmotifs instill a feeling that this is still the same adventure, but now due to your actions, things have completely changed. These strategies of leitmotif use is something that has stuck around throughout the entire Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series. Let's look at another example of leitmotif usage in video games, this time with Xenoblade Chronicles 2. We first hear this fast-paced, rapid back-and-forth tune during Counterattack, one of the themes used for the most high-stakes cutscenes of the game. Within the same theme, it also later goes through a key change by playing the same 3 notes that led up to this main tune before suddenly cutting, playing the same intro tune in a different key, and coming back hard with a tune in a new key. This key change also goes directly hand in hand with the cutscenes of the game, and the name of the theme, Counterattack, with the original key representing how the battle was going, and the new key representing the way the battle's going now.
Things are heating up!
Let's do it!
What is this?
It's called foresight.
I don't...
A prediction of what will happen in the immediate future. Read their movements to find an opening, then counter.
I get it. How did he dodge that?
This theme is also then used in later cutscenes in other styles, to draw out emotions such as sadness.
It's okay, you two. I don't care who cooks. I'm just happy with... I'm happy with...
Rex.
And then later used to create an absolutely epic finale. In both the example of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon and Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the use of leitmotifs in the final boss creates a reminder of your adventure up to that point, the feeling that this truly is the culmination of all your efforts, the epic finale of your adventure. Generally, when using a leitmotif in the final boss theme, this is the feeling games aim to capture. Leitmotifs truly are one of the key ingredients in transforming a good soundtrack into a masterful soundtrack. Whether it be using leitmotifs to symbolize the adventure up to this point, to symbolize the characters coming together for one final battle, or various other forms of symbolism leitmotifs can pull off, a leitmotif in a final boss should really draw out the feeling in the player that this is the finale. This is the culmination of their efforts. This is what it all comes down to. Breath of the Wild's final boss theme uses a leitmotif. Sort of. To be an effective leitmotif, well, you actually need to be used in multiple places. It kinda comes with the definition. But what everybody typically knows this theme as is the trailer theme. Not a theme in game, but the trailer theme. It technically exists in small parts in some scenes of the game, namely some of the memory cutscenes, or say the intro to Rito Village. So rather than this leitmotif coming from various stages of your adventure up to this point, such as in Pokemon Mystery Dungeon or Xenoblade Chronicles 2, this leitmotif instead represents several very short scenes that come from essentially glorified side quests due to the open world nature of this game. This leitmotif does not at all represent your journey. It is not something that has come along throughout your time in this world. Throughout all of Breath of the Wild, apart from the final boss theme, the most recognized place for this tune is in the trailers. So what kind of feelings is this leitmotif then supposed to evoke anyway? Man, those trailers sure were kick-ass. Instead of being a reminder of your adventure up to this point, it's a reminder of the trailers. And for anybody who hasn't seen the trailers, this tune becomes next to meaningless as a leitmotif. I mentioned that my final complaint about the final boss theme was how it relates to the rest of the game, so this criticism isn't so much about the final boss theme itself, rather it's about the lack of a presence of this leitmotif throughout the adventure, essentially rendering this leitmotif, when used in the final boss theme, pointless. I just wish we could have had a firmer presence for these themes throughout the journey, to really give the final boss validation as the conclusion of the journey. Why couldn't we have had any of this epic trailer music for some intense battles along the way, instead of the mediocre battle themes we got? Like, what about the Blight themes? Just imagine fighting the Blights with music that epic. It would really help make the Blights feel less underwhelming by having an epic score to back them, instead of just, you're fighting a big bad. If it was used during at least the Blights, then having it again during the final boss theme would make it actually feel like this is the culmination of all your trials. All of these strong boss foes you faced up to this point, this one is the final one, with strength far greater than any of the others. But no, they didn't bother to do anything like that. Or take the color parts of the trailer theme. Why can't things like that exist as you're exploring the world, to breathe life into it, to make the experience real? Heck, they could have even put the trailer themes over top of the title screen if they had to, so at least that way the final boss leitmotif wouldn't be pointless because it only really represents a trailer rather than the actual adventure, and people who've never seen the trailer could at least then be like, hey, wait a second, I recognize that tune, once they reach the finale. But no, they couldn't even be bothered to put something like that over an already silent title screen. Yeah, sure, it's better off being mute. To sum up my arguments on the music, Breath of the Wild does have some good music in there. Some are straight up jammers, Some draw inspiration and nostalgia from past entries. Some perfectly represent what they aim for, while others had the right idea but fell short of their full potential for various reasons. A lot of the soundtrack, though, just kind of felt like a mess. Whether it be themes that can't decide on what they want to be, themes that take too long before actually being jammers, themes that throw in insanely questionable additions that just detract from the overall feel, or themes that kinda want to use a leitmotif, but just can't be bothered to actually make it a leitmotif throughout the journey. And there's so many themes where I feel like they just fit what they need to well enough, but don't take it anywhere further. They don't bring the world alive emotionally, settling for themes that represent the basic feeling of the area instead of going further by bringing alive both the environment and the emotions the characters would feel by being here within this world. They don't bring the world alive emotionally, settling for themes that represent the basic feel of the area, instead of going further by bringing alive both the environment and the emotions the characters would feel by being here within this world. The final section on our journey, we've made it to the gameplay of Breath of the Wild. Let's begin this discussion at the very beginning. Players wake up in the Shrine of Resurrection, clueless about what is happening. After getting some clothes, they're introduced into the world itself, but don't really understand anything about this space we found ourselves in. The introduction of a game should serve to establish the setting, some of the characters, the conflict, but most importantly, get you settled in what you will be experiencing for the most part as you make it through this adventure. So in this way, Breath of the Wild absolutely nails it. The entire game is about constantly asking questions, working towards the answers, getting the answers, and then continuing on and asking more questions. Sometimes it's for the plot, like, what the hell happened here? Detective Link on the case! Sometimes it's for the game mechanics itself, which I'll talk about more in depth later, such as if you can do this or that with the laws of the world, to which the answer is usually yes. The entire experience of Breath of the Wild is one big cycle of asking and answering questions. So by starting out the game by placing you right down in the middle of bumblefuck nowhere with no direction other than there's some old dude over there who hates you taking his apples, the game perfectly sets up the gameplay experience of asking questions right at the get-go. Sure, it might not be as flashy and exciting as a game intro, such as say Xenoblade Chronicles 2 or Astral Chain, but all of these games succeed in capturing the overall theme of what you can expect of the adventure to come. The starting area you find yourself in is the Great Plateau, with your only guide being the apple-addicted Old Man Christmas from earlier. Well, that and Zelda once interrupting you at the most inconvenient times just to tell you to go to the Great Plateau Tower.
Link. Head for the point marked on the map in your Sheikah slate.
The Great Plateau Tower activates all the other towers around the world, in addition to now activating all the shrines to make them accessible. This tower being optional if you're feeling spicy with your skew obtaining and clipping abilities. After the tower is activated, the radical hang-gliding geezer agrees to give you his hang glider if you can collect the 4 spirit orbs located in the 4 plateau shrines, which essentially allows you to leave the Great Plateau and start your adventure for real, and keeps the plateau as a starting tutorial area until then. The plateau introduces many of the difficulties you will face later in the journey, like these mean dudes who really want to shoot you with a laser, camps of enemies you need to either deal with or sneak around, or perhaps the best example, having a frigid cold environment that needs warmer gear on to be able to stay in consistently without gradually losing health. By including this in the tutorial area, it already allows the player to overcome this obstacle in front of them in their own way. Do you want to help Old Man Christmas until he gives you warmer clothes? Do you want to cook up some cold-resistant food and then make the trek through with a timer for how long you can last? Or do you just want to run through at breakneck speed, eating food to replenish your health whenever you need? The shrines in the frozen area of the plateau are probably the most fascinating to reach for this reason, because you've already presented your players with an obstacle that they need to apply their own creativity and style in order to overcome. The whole name of the game a lot of the time feels like being able to do things your own way, to create an adventure that's truly your own. The Great Plateau gives you almost all of the main abilities that you will have throughout the adventure, a stark contrast to previous Zelda games, where typically you'll be getting a new item/ability with every dungeon that you enter. What this means for gameplay is that you're going through the entire adventure with most of your toolkit already in tow. Any challenge can in theory already be conquered if you have the skill, even the final boss. Now, how does it make you feel in previous Zelda games, where you see something you would like just out of reach and know you'll need a future item to come back and get whatever it is that you want, like a heart container or something? Because how it makes me feel is frustrated. It's like, it's literally right there, my guy. You're telling me the only reason I can't get it is because I haven't progressed the game enough? To get these items, you'll not only need to actually remember that it's something that you can get however many hours later, but you need to backtrack all the way back to wherever that is, and then backtrack all the way back onto whatever course you were on before, typically going back to progressing the story. All in all, it just feels like a tedious process to me. Some people like it, needing to go back with new abilities they've acquired, but to me, it just feels like a way to make it take longer to 100% by forcing you to revisit areas again instead of having a system where you could get that thing you wanted if you had enough skill. Breath of the Wild is that ladder system. If you see something you want, just go and get it. Sure, it might be really challenging to do early on and being unprepared, but it won't straight up block you from going and getting it by saying, remember to come back when you have the thing. Like, man, I'm not gonna remember to come back here when I have the thing. Even if I did remember, I probably wouldn't be bothered to come back here again. The incredible thing about the world opening to you in Breath of the Wild is once the Great Plateau is cleared, the world really is open to you. Some things will be a struggle early on, like you may not have enough stamina to climb certain towers, for example, but get creative and you can find a way. Cook up some stamina food, or light a fire and ride the draft up. The game rewards creativity by not telling you, you're not allowed to do this because you're not ready for this yet, by instead telling you, you're not supposed to be ready for this yet, so get creative to find a way to your goal. The game doesn't have very many progress-based barriers, and that's one of the magical parts about Breath of the Wild. If you're determined enough, you can find a way. All of your tools, apart from some cool optional ones that can help with obstacles but are never actually needed, are already in your arsenal. Yes, it will be easier if you come back when you're stronger, but it's not like you don't have the option to tackle the challenge in front of you. When Breath of the Wild released, many proclaimed that this game had the potential to be revolutionary towards the customers of the gaming industry, and this is why. Because instead of being constrained by the tools in your arsenal, your main constraint now is instead your creativity and skill as a player and knowledge of the game mechanics. For the shrines of the game, most of them exist in the world simply for the player to enter and solve the puzzles inside, but some involve a quest or a puzzle just to unlock the shrine and therefore unlock the spirit orb right as you enter. The shrine puzzles themselves are usually actually pretty neat. It's been very interesting over the past few years to see just how people have been managing to pull off coming up with their own creative solutions to solving these shrines. Some of the shrines though are just kinda Like the one where you have to find the solutions for each shrine in the other of the pair of two and wind up going back and forth a couple times to solve them both. Things like that to me just feel kind of annoying. Or take the tests of strength for example. Eventually these wind up feeling kinda repetitive, and the lack of intense music doesn't make it feel like the intense battle it should be. Don't get me started on the Blood Moon Shrine, whose idea was it to make that a shrine anyway. For the main dungeons of the game, the 4 Divine Beasts, a lot of people had problems with these dungeons feeling bland and uninteresting. Interestingly enough, I'm actually on the contrary for those assertions. I feel like the open nature of these dungeons makes some of the best dungeon environments I've experienced in the Zelda series. In previous games, there's usually a rough set of order of things that you need to do. Eventually, it builds up to getting the item of the dungeon, and then backtracking to previous areas to use this new item. Well, that and potentially overly tedious and convoluted quote-unquote puzzles. Okay, they have the boss key. Okay, when do they not have... When is the moment they get... Oh, it is in that room. Oh, come on! I have to defeat every enemy in that room? I just missed the bat? Are you kidding me? That's the solution here? To getting the boss key? You've got to be kidding me. Alright, freaking all enemies in this room must die. What do you mean? Is there a specific order? So you kill the bunny thing first, and then the bat. And then that. How is a normal player supposed to know that? How? How is this expected of the player? Oh, come on. Like, how is this the expectation? Oh, come on. So that, bat, and then you. How is a normal player supposed to know that? How? That's not okay. In Skyward Sword, at least the dungeons were designed very linearly, so once you've attained the item, you just keep pressing forward on the path that's already ahead of you to continue through the dungeon. In a lot of previous games though, it's like, oh, you found the item? Time for you to go find the one room you've already visited that you can now do something in. Have fun wandering around like a lost child at Disneyland for a while. Some people have some of the most fun when it comes to the dungeons of Zelda games. Well, not me. To me, the dungeons are typically like, ugh, this is my least favorite part of the game. Let's just get this over with. Because as I've established earlier in my ranting, I hate backtracking. It feels like it's just wasting my time. So I despise it when I get a key or an item or something and the game's like, backtrack, find where that thing goes. Like, I can put up with Skyward Sword's dungeons because they're so linear that I'm almost never backtracking. That's not to say I can't have fun with dungeons. Playing Link's Awakening DX made me actually really enjoy myself with some of the earlier dungeons, but then the last few kinda made me just want to give up, so I mean... Like that one where you have to find all the pillars to knock down, it's like, could I please just not? So typically, I'm not really the biggest fan of Zelda dungeons. In Breath of the Wild, though, the game just drops you off in this open area full of puzzles, like a parent dropping off their kid at the playground, then watching from afar and saying, "Have fun, kiddo. I won't tell you what you need to do." In previous Zelda dungeons, there was always some exact solution for everything. But like much of the game I've mentioned before, Breath of the Wild rewards creativity and coming up with your own solutions to the puzzles, like creating a chain of metal weapons to carry the electric current instead of hunting down the second electric key. I have experienced some frustration in these dungeons when there's only one thing left to activate my iPad, but apart from that, these dungeons are probably where I found some of my most enjoyment throughout dungeons in the Zelda series. The bosses, however, were largely just kinda eh. The music didn't really do anything special in my fights with them, and overall they just felt kinda underwhelming to me. Except maybe Thunderblight Ganon, who's honestly the hardest boss in the game. I should also mention the missions required to actually enter these Divine Beasts were always really cool and some of the most fun sections of the whole game, at least in my experience. Well, maybe except for the Goron one. But with that also comes one of my biggest problems with the gameplay, replayability. There's no option to replay missions like these. These missions typically only last a few minutes, and then they're gone forever, no option to hop back into some of the coolest and most satisfying few minutes that exist within the game, unless you start a new save file again. Whenever a game has just really, really fun parts of it, but then you can't ever go back and relive that again, it's just a big disappointment that you don't get that option. Zelda games have never had the option to replay missions as far as I'm aware, except for cases such as, say, Skyward Sword, allowing you to replay any of the bosses, which is the only aspect of the game I ever wanted to replay anyway, because that's where the gameplay always got the spiciest. But in Breath of the Wild, you can't replay these Divine Beast missions. You can't even replay the bosses. You defeat them once, and then they're just eradicated from that save file forever. This is one of the most frustrating aspects of many games in general, I find. Take Assassin's Creed 4, for example. Around the world, there are 4 legendary ship battles you can go into, meant as post-game content. These are the hardest ship battles in the game, and each typically took me several attempts to finally be able to defeat. It really pushed my game skill to its limit, and were some of the most incredible and satisfying battles in the entire game to do. Once you've done them though, gone. Poof. You're never seeing them again. The best battles in the entire game never respawn after you've conquered them for the first time. This is so stupid considering you can replay most of the missions in the game as many times as you want. But the legendary ships? No. This is similar to the frustration I feel with Breath of the Wild. Some of the best parts of the game gameplay-wise are just gone forever after you've beaten them for the first time. No replaying Divine Beast missions, no replaying bosses, heck, not even replaying any shrine puzzles. Let's talk about another system of the game, weapon durability. Usually, I really hate weapon durability in games, as it typically just feels annoying because I've got to constantly keep an eye on the durability and worry about replacing weapons once they've broken. Breath of the Wild continues giving you a steady stream of weapons though, so you never need to worry about actually running out, but it makes for a bit of a tricky situation when you actually want to save some of your best ones. If you develop your home in Hateno Village, you can store up to 3 main weapons, shields, and bows, but that's literally it. Why does there not exist any real storage space for weapons? So if there's a good weapon you'd like to save and hold on to, that means that most likely it's going to be taking up actual space in your inventory. So take the Champion's weapons for example, unique and spicy weapons. Just like everything else though, they break. Once they break, you can create weaker replicas of them, but the original unique weapon is just gone forever, with you doomed to never be able to obtain another one unless, you guessed it, you start your save file over from the very beginning again. This means the few frames of storage you have in Hateno, in my case at least, will always be going to these weapons, and then I can never store anything else in these slots unless I put one of the unique weapons in my inventory, which, if used a single time, is now impossible to have it in its pure 100% durability form unless you start the entire game over from the beginning again. Now, I'm the kind of player who wants as perfected of a save file as possible. Not to say I want to 100% it, but rather that I like to have the game in a state that it could become a perfect 100%, if for some reason I ever did decide I wanted to go through and 100% the game, not leaving behind a single blemish that could only be fixed by starting a new save file again. If I do something like attack even once with one of these unique weapons, then I've just royally screwed myself into never being able to have a perfect save file unless I started right from the very beginning again. You can actually replace the Hylian shield properly if it breaks, so why not the champion weapons? Or take other weapons for example. Let's say you get one of the best weapons in the game and it also has an attribute like increase attack, and now you want to save it for a big boss or something. Well, you're not going to be storing it in Hateno if your slots are being used with the champion weapons, meaning it's going to be taking up the extremely valuable space in your inventory, even if you don't plan on using it anytime soon. So instead of having my entire weapon inventory cycle throughout my adventures, I'd only have about 1 to 2 slots actually be constantly burning through new weapons I pick up, and then every other slot is just the countless weapons I'm saving because the game doesn't give you any means to actually reliably store them. If there was just like a chest in your house in Hateno or something you could dump weapons in, I would dump all my incredible weapons that I'd never actually want to touch, because I'm just that kind of guy. And then almost all my inventory slots can just cycle through new weapons all the time, like the game was meant for weapons to be used. The moment you start using one of your favorite weapons, whether it be one of the cool elemental weapons, one of those awesome boomerangs, or even just one of the best weapons you can find at the time, it's really not going to take a whole lot of time before it breaks. This makes me really not want to touch so many of these far and few between super spicy weapons, because the moment it breaks, I don't know how long it's going to take before I find another one. Because I'd hoard so many of these incredible weapons I could never put anywhere else, it meant I couldn't have reserved inventory space for things like a Korok leaf, a torch, or a flame-based weapon for when I needed them. For another durability system in a game, let's look at Fire Emblem Three Houses. Each weapon only has so many uses to it, and then it breaks. When it does though, it's not just gone forever, it remains as a broken weapon in your inventory. These weapons have an insanely reduced hit rate and damage, so they're almost never worth using unless you're using them to farm against enemies by purposefully not killing them. So what you do with these broken weapons is you take them to the blacksmith, who for some gold and smithing stones can restore the durability to the weapon, or even upgrade it to a better version of the weapon in the process if you can afford it. In previous Fire Emblem games, I'd have a rough idea in mind for a final inventory set for each one of my units. But whenever things broke, I needed to go to the shop to buy new ones and try to remember, what did I have on them again anyway? In Three Houses though, you can have set organized inventories for everyone, because whenever anything breaks, it stays in your inventory, so just pay the blacksmith a visit and have it repaired or upgraded. Imagine if Breath of the Wild had a system like this. If a weapon of yours broke, it just became a broken version of that weapon and went into an inventory section specifically for broken weapons so that it doesn't take up unneeded space. Then you can cycle more new weapons into those slots and leave this broken one kicking around for the day that you want to bring it to a blacksmith to repair it and restore it to its former glory. This would do so many things. It would fix this whole inventory and weapons breaking problem I've had with the game. It would fix the issue of the champion weapons never being able to be pristine on that save file again if you so much as touch them once. And it would actually bring so much more use to the various gemstones you're collecting and harvesting around the world anyway. Under the assumption that you'd be using those gemstones for weapon repairs. If that, plus reliable storage in Hateno was done for this game, I would love the weapon system so much more. It's just such a big missed opportunity. And speaking of the weapon system and durability, the Master Sword. The fact that it breaks and then needs a recharge, just... like, I get it so that you can cycle through and use several different weapons, but there are weapons better for certain situations than the Master Sword anyway, and the sword just being like, you used me too much, let me take a break, is just so out of character for the Master Sword. We were talking about ludonarrative dissonance way earlier in this discussion. That might actually be a good example of it. Again, ludonarrative dissonance is when the story that the gameplay tells and the story that the narrative tells disagree with one another. So the narrative telling the story of this absolutely incredible legendary sword, the Blade of Evil's Bane, and then the gameplay telling the story of the sword that needs to take a break every once in a while, it kinda contradicts one another. At least that's how I feel. For the champion abilities that you obtain from each of the 4 dungeons throughout the world, these are all actually really cool buffs that you can toggle on and off at any time. Revali's Gale is by far the most useful out of all of them, allowing you to quickly soar up to scale walls you otherwise wouldn't be able to, make climbing just that bit faster, or just be a tool to escape combat. Daruk's Protection can be a nice safety net to have for those times that you mistime your parry. Mipha's Grace is just like a freak fairy on steroids, so it's another nice safety net to just have around in case you need it. Urbosa's Fury I found to be the least useful of them all, but it could be a spicy way to mix up combat when I felt like it. All of these abilities have 3 uses before they need to recharge, except for Mipha's Grace, with only 1, since it's literally a revive. Rather than getting some item from the dungeons that now allows you to access more in the world, Breath of the Wild gives you all of what's actually needed in your kit right at the beginning. These abilities you get from the dungeons are just really nice optional things, which I actually really like. You can do about anything in the world at any point. These abilities just make it a bit easier and fun. I do have one big problem with these abilities though, which is the recharge. I'm the kind of person that always wants to have the maximum of something that only has a few uses of it, so that I have all 3 uses ready for when I need it. Well, if you use 1 charge of these abilities, it doesn't start recharging. It only actually begins recharging after you've used up all 3 uses. Meaning, if you use, say, Urbosa's Fury once at some point, but wanted 3 charges for some boss coming up, then unless you use the other 2 charges somewhere along the line, it doesn't matter how much time passed, you'll still only have 2 charges. This means when it comes to these abilities, to make sure that I have all my charges prepared for when I actually want them, if I use up 1 or 2 of my charges for some reason, I'll just use the rest so that I can actually start recharging. Maybe I used Revali's Gale to scale 1 cliff. Time to sit here for a second to use it 2 more times on the spot to make sure I have all 3 charges prepared, just in case I find a situation where I want all 3. Why do these charges need to recharge all together? Why can't each charge have its own recharge, so much time passes for you to get 1 charge back? So if you use up 2 charges, it will take longer to get 3 again than if you used 1, but as long as it's not capped out, it can be recharging, instead of you needing to empty the charges entirely before the recharge even starts. Imagine if shooter games did this. You're not allowed to reload your weapon until your current clip has been completely emptied. This is how it feels with these abilities in Breath of the Wild. They're really cool and awesome abilities, but it just sucks so much how you need to completely use it up before it recharges, forcing you to waste charges just so you can be at capacity again later. I've proposed some big changes to various systems of the game throughout this gameplay discussion, but this change to the abilities is something so small that it's like, why isn't this a part of the game anyway? It seems like a no-brainer. The general gameplay of the game usually just winds up feeling like an overall smooth and satisfying experience, filled with countless small things you can do that make a big difference. The paraglider, for example, it opens up your mobility options, and therefore opens up each of the areas you explore so many times over by simply allowing you to glide around. Or take bullet time, for example. It's such a wonderful way to have a feature that just makes you feel like, hey, I just did something pretty cool. And it's such a great way to really add some extra spice to combat. Speaking of adding extra spice, Flurry Rush is so good. It feels kinda cool to do, and it rewards players for being skilled and risky with their dodging abilities. Having several different weapon types also makes for a more fun combat experience by changing up exactly how Link is even fighting in the first place. And the bow having so much more of a prevalent place within Link's kit than any game before, making him into more of an archer than he's ever been, it really does increase the ways in which the player can handle combat and gameplay in their own unique style. This game also has several things that aren't evident to the average blind player that typically become known through word of mouth. Like shield surfing, for example. Just who would have guessed that there was a set of inputs you can do to start surfing on your shield? Just imagine my little cousin's expression as I see him heading down a mountain on a Switch, and I lean over and tell him, "You can surf on your shield, you know," and he's just like, "Really? How?" The fact that there exists things like that where you can share these almost secret techniques with others, it's actually rather neat. The physics of the world is also something really incredible. Oftentimes, if you think you can do it, you can do it. Need extra height with your paraglider? Start a fire to ride up the updraft. Need to cross a river? Well, you could just put the last piece of the bridge into place to walk across, or you could attempt to launch yourself over with the bridge piece instead. Tall cliff you need to scale? You could try climbing it, or you could just take a rock elevator to the top. The mechanics of this world exist in such a way to allow for creative solutions, and rewarding players' skill and creativity for trying out a trickier solution to each problem. For one other nitpick that I wasn't sure where to fit into this video, sometimes the horses are a bit wonky. Like, just go straight. Stop stopping because the wall is remotely close. The horses will typically follow the path ahead of them on their own, but that sometimes means that they'll, well, do stuff like this. Now, let's talk about the final boss. Once you start the battle against Calamity Ganon, he'll have 12.5% of his health removed for every Divine Beast you captured, up to a maximum of 50% for all 4, before the battle even starts. This battle can prove a bit challenging at first, but once you start getting the feel for it a bit, it's typically really not all that bad. It's arguably the toughest foe in the entire game, so the opponent that you can face to push your skill the most, and after beating the game, you can come back here to fight him again whenever you want. But let's go back to the arguments on replayability. Sure, you can fight him again whenever you'd like, but for every Divine Beast you recapture, that's a part of Calamity Ganon's health you're never going to get back, half of it if you've recaptured all 4. This makes this fight, honestly, kinda short, and kinda underwhelming. This is supposed to be a game all about doing things your way, so I really wish there was a way for you to refight Calamity without having half his health be deleted right before the battle, just because you went around and did the dungeons. Then there's the second phase of the final boss, which is just... I already talked about this battle during the music section of this discussion, namely about how the battle is just so slow and dull that the epic music is no longer fitting, so I won't spend too long on it here. But the final battle typically should really push your game knowledge, apply what you've learned throughout the journey, and feel like an epic conclusion to this whole adventure you've been on. Instead, you're presented with an Alzheimer's-ridden dark beast who can't remember if he's supposed to attack you or just stumble around like a lost child at the grocery store. Brief times you actually get to attack, it's just shooting a few targets, and after you've done each set, you could be waiting around twiddling your thumbs for up to over half a minute just so that you can play the video game some more. Like, if I wanted a slow-paced experience, I would have booted up some New Horizons. Heck, if I wanted a faster-paced experience than this, I'd have booted up New Horizons. There exists no challenge to this battle, making it feel just completely underwhelming. As long as you're moving at like a walking speed, you never have to worry about being hit by this guy. Like, if they were going to have this battle be the final boss, at least spice it up a bit. Have him swipe with his claws and do an occasional AoE shockwave or something, so that you actually have to try to avoid getting hit, and have there be several targets on him constantly appearing before vanishing a few seconds later, with each one only taking off a small portion of his health, instead of shooting a few at once and then waiting around like, well, how are you doing today? How's the wife? How's the kids? Weather sure has been nice lately, hasn't it? Work going well? How's your hobby been going? Having a gimmicky and underwhelming final boss at the end of the game is just a surefire way to leave a sour taste in the mouths of players. If you're going to do something completely different for your final boss than the rest of the gameplay, then it should at least be an engaging and epic conclusion instead of, well, we tried. As for the DLC, I own it, but I can't really speak that much about it because I didn't get very far. I heard that apparently there was more backstory added, new cutscenes and such, so I hopped in looking forward to experiencing that all. I started doing the 4 shrines around the world, but I just got so bored with doing that because it all just felt so samey, and I wasn't getting any cutscene reward or anything like that by that point, so I just felt completely bored, honestly. I don't know at what point in the DLC you get the cutscenes, but it really didn't engage me enough to get that far. When I eventually do my full proper playthrough of the game on the channel, proper meaning not the 10-part series that I've already done of beating the game in one sitting for charity, which you can find in the description below by the way, I'll probably cover doing the DLC content as well. When that day comes, I can experience this additional story content blind. Maybe it'll turn out to be something that makes me actually enjoy the story more. Overall, the gameplay of Breath of the Wild at the end of the day really is something special. It breathes a new light not only into the Zelda series, but into the gaming industry on ways to go about handling progression and rewarding player creativity and skill. It's definitely not perfect, but honestly, in terms of gameplay, I really do think it's the most fun Zelda game I've ever played. Sometimes I feel like I'm a Zelda fan who's not supposed to be a Zelda fan, because of how little I'm actually enjoying some of the titles in the series. Take Wind Waker and Twilight Princess for example. They've both got some great music, and stories that are good enough to at least engage me throughout and intrigue me about the lore of the world. But when it came to the gameplay, finding what it was I had to do next, then going through the dungeons that I'm never all that fond of, it just feels tedious to me. And Twilight Princess, I love the characters, the world, the music. It just seems like something that would be an overall enjoyable experience. But when it came to the gameplay, especially in the dungeons, it just felt so tedious to me so much of the time, like it was a massive chore to get through. I actually had to force myself to get all the way through Twilight Princess, just so I could say I've beaten the game before. Or let's look at Wind Waker. That game presents a vast world for you to explore across its ocean, but that's the thing. It's just a whole lot of water. 7.8 out of 10. Breath of the Wild felt like a vast open world to explore. Wind Waker felt like a whole bunch of nothing in every direction as far as the eye can see. For me personally, I just really didn't get enjoyment out of exploring this world. And Wind Waker definitely has its fair share of tedious sections, the worst case being the hunt for the Triforce. Like, one moment you're continuing your adventure, and then the next it's like, if you'd like to progress the story, scour the whole world looking for all the pieces of the Triforce. I could make an entire video on why this quest sucks if I wanted to. You've got next to no clues about where to actually look for these things, and some really are in the most obscure places. Some, maybe you'll need to buy a treasure map and go salvage it. Maybe you'll need to find some obscure island and make it through several rooms of shenanigans. I honestly don't think I'd be capable of beating this game without the help of the internet, even after they made this quest significantly easier for the Wii U version. This is the difference between the open worlds of Wind Waker and Breath of the Wild. Wind Waker says, we've got a big open world for you. If you want to progress, you need to scour this whole thing. It forces you to explore. Breath of the Wild, however, says, there's a vast open world for you. It is now your playground. Do with it as you wish. If I was a kid playing Wind Waker, all the time in the world where I can dump countless hours into games like I did with titles like Mario Galaxy, Pokemon, or Roller Coaster Tycoon, I probably would have had way more fun just exploring around the world of Wind Waker. But nowadays, if a game throws something at me like, to progress, you gotta explore around until you find what it is you need, whether it be the open world of Wind Waker, or needing to backtrack to use your new item in a Zelda dungeon until you find what room you need to use it in, or needing to come back to a certain location later in the adventure once you have an ability you get later in the story. It just makes me go, come on, just get on with it. I've got things to do, like writing a script on Breath of the Wild that's now nearly 60 pages long as I'm counting it. Holy crap. If there's one thing that turns me off from playing a game the most, apart from anything Atari makes nowadays, it's the feeling like I'm not making progress. And games like Wind Waker make me constantly feel like I'm not doing anything that's actually bringing me closer to beating the game. In Breath of the Wild, there are plenty of things in the world for you to do that give you the feeling of making progress, whether it be conquering shrines, completing side quests, hunting or foraging for more food supplies to prepare for future battles, acquiring new weapons and armor, upgrading your armor, adding horses to the stables, recapturing divine beasts, building a house, or countless else. No matter what it is you're doing, you're almost always doing something that gives you the feeling of forward progress. In Wind Waker, if I'm exploring around, maybe I'll find an outpost with some enemies on it, I'll defeat them and maybe break some pots and get some rupees. Yay? Or maybe I'll go treasure hunting and wind up getting some rupees as well. Worthwhile or waste of time? You can find things like pieces of heart around the world, but most of the time that's not the reward you're getting from visiting these outposts or submarine locations. Breath of the Wild had me constantly feeling like I'm doing something that contributed towards making me stronger. It always felt like I was making progress in some way, whether it be getting in just one more shrine for the day or raiding an enemy camp. This is also why Breath of the Wild is the perfect game for the Nintendo Switch. Perfect to just pick up and play for a little while, maybe get a couple more shrines in for the day, and then just put it back in the dock to charge. This feeling of constant progress was one of the biggest key ingredients in keeping me engaged throughout the gameplay experience, unlike some games that just seem to turn me off when I feel like I'm not doing anything productive. This is also one of the reasons I typically prefer linear games over open world games. Take Mario Galaxy compared to Mario Odyssey, for example. In Mario Galaxy, for every star, you've got a level to conquer, along with a list of everything you've done and have yet to do. Almost every star is a linear path to the end of each of these levels, as you obtain them one by one and make further progress to 100%ing it. Mario Galaxy was actually the first game I 100%ed, as both Mario and Luigi. Then there's Mario Odyssey, which says, here's your world, now go find moons, without any clear-cut objective to obtain many of them really. Each time you collect a moon, you're reducing how many moons are available to collect in the area, and therefore making it harder to find more moons in the area. Finding one moon out of say 30 in an area is easier than finding the last one in the area. So every time you collect one, it feels like you're making future ones that little smidge harder to find. So a lot of the time, if I'm playing something like Mario Odyssey, it can feel like I'm making no progress towards advancing my journey as I run around hoping I find a moon somewhere, whereas in something like Mario Galaxy, I'm always feeling like I'm making progress forward. I understand the appeal of open world games, but they're generally just not my cup of tea because I personally have a hard time feeling like I'm actually making progress depending on how the game is structured. The way Breath of the Wild is structured with its open world, however, seldom gave me that feeling like I wasn't making any progress, so it was always a joy to be able to hop in and enjoy some more of it. While I can't commend Breath of the Wild for the way it handled story and music, I can at least acknowledge that I believe in terms of gameplay, it is the most fun and engaging Zelda game I've played to date. Breath of the Wild really does have something special going for it, especially through the ways it has challenged the conventions of game design itself. It put itself out there to try something new, but because of the leaps and bounds made by the gameplay, it hurt the story and music as a consequence. How do you tell a linear story through a non-linear adventure? How do you have a leitmotif be present throughout an adventure where you don't even know what your player is going to do? I feel like there wasn't enough consideration given to these sorts of questions during the development of this adventure. The story, I feel like in some places, was on the right track to making an engaging and compelling story, such as how Zelda's character was written, but due to the open-ended nature of this adventure, I found myself unable to connect with the characters in this journey emotionally, because they all felt like they had so little of a presence during this adventure. As well, rather than having one important companion character, instead having 8 characters of 4 companions and 4 champions, each with little to no screen time, really hurt the character writing, and prevented me from caring about these characters. The story in many places to me just didn't feel cohesive, like it wasn't quite yet the right formula to go about for an adventure like this. Sure, it stifled the overall feel of the game of constantly asking questions and having them answered, but as soon as you were finished with one plot point, you'd have already moved on to the next, hurting the ability to develop the big picture like a linear adventure is capable of. A linear adventure can transition from one plot point to another, making it easy to follow along as it progresses. Breath of the Wild often jumps plot points, however, making it more difficult to develop a, well, linear story, due to the nature of the game itself, considering the player can go off and do something else whenever they want. Sure, Zelda games have never had the best of stories. It's not like there's some JRPG or a completely story-based game that exists for its ability to share a narrative. But I feel like at the end of the day, they're typically still engaging and enjoyable stories. Breath of the Wild had a legacy and expectations to live up to try to meet the standards set by titles before it, despite needing to learn how to craft a story around a format that makes it the most difficult to tell a story, by having a non-linear adventure. Yes, I don't like the story of Breath of the Wild, but at the end of the day, can I really pass blame and judgment for what the story wound up becoming? How do you write a story without a set order the player experiences it? You can tell a serious effort was made. Well, in some regards to the plot at least. But unfortunately, I feel like this new format held it back in the end because there wasn't enough account for the new open-ended format in the creation of the story. I hope that the developers and writers of the Zelda team can use experiences like this to be able to grow, to experiment until they can get down how to properly flush out a story in this kind of brand new format to the Zelda series. But I feel there's few of those willing to point out its flaws in comparison to those who simply accept it as a masterpiece. Personally, I feel it's rash to say that Breath of the Wild's story is without flaw when the developers had to contend with forming a story around a format not meant for storytelling for the first time in the series, which caused several issues along the way. But to be fair, there are a few out there who can nail something completely different than what they're used to on the first attempt. But how can it be used as an opportunity to learn and grow, to continue experimenting with this new format to really try and get it down, when there are countless players as critics, preaching that everything is perfect as is? I think it's important to not get carried away with something someone loves, to turn a blind eye to its imperfections, to take away the ability to have a good look and analyze it. In my use of history in video games class, we needed to write an essay on a historical video game for the ways it uses the past and abstracts it. Our professor recommended us not to write on something we love, as that might take away one's ability to really analyze the material, by instead just focusing on what we love, and recommended us to instead write on something we were at least familiar with, but had maybe never played before, going in with a fresh perspective, which, for me, was Assassin's Creed 2. I had played several other titles in the series, but never that one. The idea was, if we wrote on a game we loved, it would be too easy for our papers to be naming all the things we love about it, rather than being able to tackle the experience from a more critical and analytical perspective. My point is, it's important to not let one's love for something stand in the way of being able to notice its imperfections and flaws. I once thought that Breath of the Wild was a masterpiece in all aspects as well. I'd been a Zelda fan for a long time, and hopped into this fresh game with only the knowledge of the trailers, which really riled up my unhealthy hype even further, and experienced what was one of the most fun games I had ever played gameplay-wise. I was ready to love the story before it even began, but as it went on, I began to question it. Was this really the narrative I convinced myself it was? I feel like it's easy to fall in love with either a series, or one of the three aspects of story, music, or gameplay in the case of Breath of the Wild, and then to have a naturally higher opinion of the other aspects. Yes, the gameplay is fun as heck, but that doesn't mean the other aspects will naturally match the same level of quality, but it can be easy to forget that. Nobody likes to hear criticisms in something meaningful to them, to hear something that could potentially detract from their experience when they love something as dearly as, say, the gameplay of Breath of the Wild in this example. I personally feel like one of the biggest reasons Breath of the Wild is praised as a masterpiece by so many is because of the gameplay. Letting one out of the three aspects shape an opinion on the experience as a whole, rather than taking the time to really separate these aspects and analyze them on their own, free of bias because of how good or bad the other aspects or even other titles in the series may be. One of my personal favorite games of all time, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon 2, the Explorers games. It can be easy for me to look at how good the story and most of the soundtrack is, and simply decide that the entire game is absolutely incredible. But it's taken me some time to realize that the gameplay is just something I find kind of annoying to deal with, and that several of the dungeon themes can be pretty annoying and repetitive. Sure, the story and music working together makes for an absolutely incredible experience. That doesn't mean that the gameplay isn't, in my opinion, a kind of wacky mess that's luckily been fixed in more recent games to actually make me genuinely have fun with Mystery Dungeon gameplay finally. In the case of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon 2, as much as I adore the story and music, I can acknowledge that gameplay at the end of the day really isn't anything to write home about. In the case of Breath of the Wild, while the gameplay, apart from some nitpicks, really is an absolutely incredible and unique experience, I don't want to let that cloud my judgment in seeing just how the story and music couldn't pull their weight, largely due to the open world nature and pacing of the game, but also due in part to questionable decisions and what felt at times like a lack in confidence in this new style. But for one of my biggest problems with Breath of the Wild, it's how the game relates to the trailers. The trailers portray, frankly, an absolutely epic adventure. The trailer music is absolutely breathtaking, and the way that it goes with the footage makes it feel like it's some insane JRPG level story that's about to blow your socks off. With the way it's portrayed, it frankly seemed like it was going to be one of the most incredible and in-depth narrative experiences, one of the most breathtaking and captivating soundtracks, and gameplay that's consistently presenting you with absolutely epic encounters. But then what the actual gameplay almost completely amounts to is just fucking around. Don't get me wrong, fucking around in Breath of the Wild is really fun, and makes for something great to put bits of time into here and there on a handheld console like the Switch. But throughout the entire adventure, I never felt what I felt with the trailer. I never felt that high-stakes intensity with an incredible score to back it up. I never felt that challenge that the trailer seemed to portray. I never felt this emotionally. The little skirmishes in the trailer feel 10 times more intense and epic than either phase of the final boss in the actual game. The product you wind up getting won't always be true to the trailer portraying it. Anybody who's played Assassin's Creed Unity on launch is familiar with this. Sometimes trailers will be vastly different. In some rare cases, you might see this done on purpose. Or other times, maybe it'll be a misinterpretation of how the end product will turn out. But generally, you want to create the best possible game trailer you can for the sake of grabbing attention and convincing people that this game is worth their time. I've actually helped to create a game trailer before within the game making group I was a part of for my game design class. We even had one of the lead trailer designers on the E3 Dragon Age Inquisition trailer come in to give us a lecture on game trailers, and to dismantle our crappy ones. Along the way, we learned some interesting things trailers may do, such as transitioning in such a way that your eyes stay looking at roughly the same spot from one scene to another, or how trailers like Gears of War will feature a figure running from left to right throughout the entire trailer, and then right at the end, switching from right to left. A lot goes into making an effective game trailer, and I feel like Breath of the Wild's trailers are probably some of the best trailers in the industry, but I feel as though they misinterpret what to expect from the game by making seemingly false promises. Here's some story time from my experience with Breath of the Wild. March 2nd, 2017. The Switch was the new console about to come out, but nowhere near enough consoles were made to account for the unanticipated level of demand. Few people had pre-orders, and those who didn't had to bunker in front of a store for hours in the hope that there would be enough consoles for them. I was in the latter group, and I was in insanely hot anticipation of both this console and of Breath of the Wild, especially after the trailers made it seem in my head like it was going to be one of the greatest games I'd ever play. My hype for it really was unhealthy. I was in a mall that day, in front of an EB Games store. You know, Canadian GameStop. I got there at about 3 PM for the midnight release, and I believe there were 22 people already there in line. My cousin showed up about an hour later since he was in the area. Started talking with him for a while, and then he just kinda decided to stick around in line as well. He was actually one of the few who managed to snag a pre-order. Not with EB Games, but with Best Buy. But he figured he'd rather get the Switch on launch than wait the few days it would take for his online pre-order to get to him. So we waited in line 9 hours for the midnight release. After the first several hours of waiting, the store manager passed out tickets for everyone currently in line of basically, if you've got a ticket, you can buy a Switch, to keep track of how many people can be served with their available inventory. She had 55 tickets, which was the exact amount of people in line when she passed them out, which she told us was to her great relief because there was a young kid at the back of the line. Once the doors opened at midnight, it took another hour for my 23rd place in line to actually get a Switch, so I wound up going home after 1 AM at launch with the Nintendo's new console. But the thing is, I didn't get any games that day, because I had those ordered online due to the 20% discount off of new games that came with Amazon Prime. Yeah, remember the days when Amazon Prime was actually good for gamers? So I set up my Switch when I got home, went to sleep, woke up for the day of March 3rd, couldn't do anything with my Switch other than set up my profile and such, and just stare at it after waiting for so long. March 4th, 2017. I turned 18 that day. Wouldn't really have much time to do anything though, because of my dad's contract brewing company that he was running at the time. I was expected to come in and help bottle cases of beer all day long at this pub and brewery whose equipment was rented out. I was really hoping Breath of the Wild would arrive for me before I left that morning, and lo and behold, it did. Literally 1 minute before I left. So I brought along my Switch. So my 18th birthday, I spent all day long in a bar. Didn't have any alcohol to drink. It was a 10-hour workday. During my breaks of work, I'd be trying out Breath of the Wild for the first time after having been so ready to play it since it was announced, but especially during the last several days. When it came to bottling work, we had an assembly line going, and the station where I spent the most of my time was in sanitation, where I'd take the new bottles and dump them in a barrel filled with sanitized water, so as to clean out any dust or anything from the bottles before they're filled with beer. So I'm spending hours on end with my hands dunked in sanitized water. So as the day went on, my hands dissolved more and more, and it began to hurt to hold anything. Despite that, during breaks as well as at the end of the 10-hour workday after being home again, I continued to play Breath of the Wild. I had much more time on Sunday of the 5th of March since there was no work to do that day, but for the next several days my hands had like a weird plasticky layer to them from having been in sanitizer for hours and hours. So I couldn't play any game very well at all for a while, but I kept on because this was the game I had been waiting so long for. I definitely had fun along the way, but as I continued through this adventure, I was still waiting for when I got that feel from the trailer. It kept not happening, and I always figured it would just happen some point later in the game. As it went on though, my hopes began to die down. I went in with the expectations that this would be some incredible narrative, with one of the greatest soundtracks I'd ever hear if it was even a fraction as good as the trailer music, but instead I got a game about exploring and fucking around. Exploring and fucking around was hella fun, and I stand by the statement that to me, it's the most fun Zelda game I've ever played, but it wasn't what I expected the game to deliver. I expected so much more from the story and music, and while the gameplay was fun, it never hit that same feel, that same intensity, that same emotional connection, that same high-stakes feeling the trailer seemed to imply this game was going to deliver to me. The biggest issue I have with Breath of the Wild is that to me, it was a complete disappointment. Yes, the amount of hype I had for the game was probably too much. But to me, the most important aspects of a game are the story and music. It's the two aspects I take with me when I put the game down, the part that becomes immortalized in my memory. And the way the trailers made the story and music appear as something they just weren't, it's just I had such high expectations only to be let down. I honestly believe that Breath of the Wild is the most disappointed I have ever been with a game in terms of it not meeting my expectations, second most being Roller Coaster Tycoon World. It's like I ordered something at a restaurant and they wind up giving me a completely different meal. It's still a good meal in its own right, so I'll still eat it and find enjoyment out of my experience, but it's not what I ordered, so I'm left with the disappointment that I don't have my sides of story and music up to the standards I'd be able to reach, and my toppings of epicness and emotion. Let's finally address the title of this whole shtick. Breath of the Wild is not a masterpiece. What does it actually mean to be a masterpiece of a game? I believe there exist different types of masterpieces when it comes to games. How I analyze games is through the three aspects of story, music, and gameplay, and how these three coexist with one another. I think what a masterpiece is constituted by the amount it contributes to each of these three aspects, and how important each of those aspects is to you personally. Like for me, do I need that to constitute a masterpiece a game needs to nail all three aspects? Surprisingly, no. I personally consider a game to be a masterpiece if it has a masterful soundtrack and narrative. If the gameplay is good, then that's just a bonus, but it's not something I factor into my definition as heavily as some. I believe it's important to be able to view games with a lens that separates them into these aspects to determine how good they really are. Take Fire Emblem Fates for example. Absolutely nails the music aspect, and the gameplay aspect is honestly pretty good too. But for the story? Well, it, exists, I guess. Or take the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers titles. Those games have a heavy focus on the story and music aspects, though the gameplay is often kinda eh. I think that different games will have their own unique focuses on each of these aspects, and that not every game necessarily needs to perfect each one of these three aspects. I consider Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers a masterpiece, even if I feel like the gameplay aspect really doesn't do anything for me. If anybody asked me if this game was a masterpiece through its gameplay, that would be a hard no. Through the story or music, however, absolutely. For Breath of the Wild, looking at the aspects of story, music, and gameplay on their own, is Breath of the Wild a gameplay masterpiece? Honestly, maybe. You could make the argument for it either way. In my opinion, there are some flaws that hold the gameplay back from falling under my definition of masterpiece. If these things had been handled differently, I could see myself calling at least the gameplay aspect of Breath of the Wild a masterpiece. Breath of the Wild's gameplay really is something special. It challenges the conventions of game design, rewards player creativity, and creates an environment where you can make an adventure that's truly your own. Is Breath of the Wild a story or music masterpiece though? I would argue absolutely not. Both fall apart to some degree by nature of the open world design itself, and both, I would argue, also have design flaws that really hold them back from their full potential. I do not consider either the story or the music of Breath of the Wild close at all to what I would consider to be some of gaming's greatest narratives or soundtracks. I mentioned before that under my own definition of a masterpiece, a game needs to absolutely nail both story and music, but not gameplay. Why is that anyway? Whether or not the gameplay is fun, the story and music is what makes the experience meaningful. Video games are a facet for storytelling unlike any other, by placing you into the shoes of the characters whose adventures you are experiencing firsthand. With the use of a story and music through the medium of a video game, it has the potential to reflect the emotions of the characters onto the player. To make you feel hurt when they feel pain, saddened when they are down, determined when they are. A well-crafted story can make you care for these characters on a personal level, and the music can be used to embody the emotions they feel throughout the journey. Story and music bring meaning to your actions through the gameplay, and are the aspects that can become immortalized from the experience of a game. If you asked me about my gameplay experience of, say, Xenoblade Chronicles, I could mention the gameplay systems, how they worked and how I liked them and whatnot. But if I needed to talk about specifics of my own gameplay, my memories about what happened while I played, I couldn't pull up a single specific memory or event that happened during my own gameplay. It's not something that gets carried along. If you ask me about the story, however, I could write you a full essay on the spot, along with quotes and all, without needing to look back at the source material, about how Shulk's character develops throughout the story, how his goals shift from single-minded revenge to seeking out peace, to something even further beyond that. I could talk about his hatred, his doubts in himself, the times he falters, the times he stays determined, his views on his allies, the development of his willingness to see himself in others, and so much more. The music comes along with me wherever I go. Whenever it comes on my playlist, it brings back the memories of just what Shulk and his friends were going through at the time. Or whenever I hear something from Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers and hear that leitmotif again, it brings back memories of the story that unfolded. A story can be so much more than just something to give the player a reason to keep playing. A narrative can be something the player carries on with them even after the game is over. It can make arguments, teach lessons, show another side of things, or show us more about ourselves. A soundtrack can be so much more than just something to fit the surroundings. A soundtrack can draw out the emotions the characters would feel by being here. It can bring the situation to life by building the world around you. It can create key changes to signify a change in the present, or use leitmotifs to draw parallels to the past. Whereas gameplay is what you experience in the here and now. While I may think of an easygoing fun time with Breath of the Wild when I think of my experience with the gameplay, I couldn't name you any specific memory from my time with the gameplay from 3 years ago. Gameplay pertains to your experience in the present. Story and music carry on into the future, and have the potential to immortalize your experience. This is why I hold story and music in the highest esteem, while gameplay doesn't hold as important of a place. In the case of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon Explorers, my life genuinely feels better off for experiencing such a narrative, and I know I'm not the only one who feels that way. My video discussion on the history and importance of the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon series had incredible reception, along with many of who shared their own experience with the series in the comments, shedding light on how the games have been responsible for feats of teaching friendship and compassion, to inspiring careers in writing, to even making steps towards overcoming depression. Whether it's playing Breath of the Wild, Xenoblade Chronicles, Pokemon Mystery Dungeon, or anything else, years down the line, my experience with the gameplay won't be what I remember, but story and music will be. This is why I define masterpieces as titles with masterful story and music, without the need for compelling gameplay, because story and music is the means by which the game will carry on with me into the future. If it has great gameplay as well, then that's fantastic, but not needed. 2 of my top 5 favorite games have gameplay I don't even like. I feel like too many judge a game too much on the gameplay over the other aspects of story and music, especially a lot of those who have one of their main jobs being creating reviews, being influencers within the gaming industry. I feel like I consistently see games that focus on story and music get thrown under the bus, while those with the best gameplay are lifted up and praised as the greatest of the industry. Maybe my standards are just different. To sum up my arguments, Breath of the Wild is a fantastic game, just not the fantastic game I expected, and came with it what I felt like was sloppiness in applying story and music in this new open world style of play. While it may be the most disappointed I have ever been with a game, I can still acknowledge what it does right, and how despite its flaws, it is an excellent starting point in paving the way forward for new game design practices within the industry. I really hope that with future titles they can learn from the mistakes made along the way to continue to hone this new formula until they're finally comfortable creating a cohesive experience with this new environment. I just worry that with how much Breath of the Wild is praised as a masterpiece without the willingness to call out its flaws, that nothing would be learned. Why change anything if all the criticisms are drowned out by countless praise of masterpiece? I think it's important to be able to take a step back from what's meaningful to you, to be able to look at it in a more critical way, rather than ignoring what you fear may sour your experience or interpretation of what you're passionate about. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video.